Lyanna Stark did not die at the Tower of Joy, though she came perilously close, pallid, trembling, and drenched in sweat. She clung to life with all the stubborn grace that Ned Stark knew so well in her. Every breath rattled in her chest, and for days it seemed she would pass as her mother had, as her father had, as so many of House Stark had done before her, but the gods or fate or sheer willpower granted her a reprieve. Ned still remembered the moment his sword arm faltered upon seeing her amidst blood-stained sheets, her hair fanned across the pillows. Arthur Dane lay dead on the stones outside the tower, the dust settling around his silver helm. Dawn, his great white sword, had gleamed in the daylight, as though reluctant to taste the dryness of the dirt after cutting through the morning air. Ser Oswell had been slain as well. Only Ned, Howland Reed, and Lyanna remained conscious, and the latter was barely so. In her delirium, Lyanna clutched Ned's hand, tears of relief streaking her sunken cheeks the moment she recognized him. "You have to promise me," she said in a broken whisper, and Ned, thinking her final hour had arrived, bent his ear to her lips. In that moment, he believed she wanted him to keep Rhaegar's child safe. The silent form lay cradled near her, swaddled in thick wool and black fur, too small and red-faced to make much noise beyond the soft sniffling of newborn dreams. The babe had Rhaegar's silver touch in the wisps of hair on his head, but also that warm Stark coloring in his complexion. Lyanna's eyes, feverish though they were, roamed from her brother's face to the child's, anxious, desperate. Ned had whispered, "I promise you," voice trembling in the hush of that ruin. He believed those to be her final words. But no black wings came to herald her end, no last heartbeat stilled. Instead, her eyes closed and she slipped into a darkness that was not death, but a prolonged fever dream. Howland Reed, loyal and resourceful, found the means and herbs to keep her alive. They broke down what remained of that forlorn tower, fashioned a makeshift litter, and carried Lyanna back north. In the months that followed, Lyanna's health wavered, leaving her a pale shadow of the fierce girl who once raced horses against her brother Brandon. She had lost weight, her beauty tempered into a haunted elegance, and her voice grew softer than snowdrift. But she lived. Each day, she grew a little stronger, until she could sit up on her own and feed herself without trembling. Ned, exhausted from the horrors of the war and the knowledge that Robert Baratheon now wore the crown, cared for her in secret at a distant holdfast near the neck, with only a handful of trusted men to guard them. He told none but Howland Reed the truth of the boy's parentage, calling him John in memory of Jon Arryn's steadfast guardianship, but letting others assume it was a bastard of his own. In that hush of secrecy, Lyanna lay awake many nights, recalling every year of her short yet tumultuous life in Winterfell. She was haunted by images of Rhaegar Targaryen, silver-haired and sad-eyed, placing a crown of blue roses upon her head at Harrenhal. The hush of the crowd in the moment he passed over his own wife to name Lyanna the Queen of Love and Beauty. She was haunted by the final day she saw him alive, his expression resolute yet tender, whispering some promise of a better future for them all. And she was haunted most by the memory of Robert Baratheon's wide grin, how she'd once admired his boisterous good humor before discovering the darkness that lurked beneath. She did not emerge from that secret place for almost a year. In that time, Robert had assumed the Iron Throne, Cersei Lannister had become his queen, and the realm began to settle into the uneasy peace that followed any major rebellion. Ned returned to Winterfell, where he took up his role as the new head of House Stark after the deaths of his father and brother. He told all who questioned him that the rebellious, high-spirited Lyanna had died of her fever. And though the region mourned the loss of the wild wolf girl, only a few tears were shed in far-off corners of the realm. The war had taken so many lives that names and faces blurred for most. Lyanna Stark was one more casualty in the dance of swords. But Lyanna lived, tucked away in the damp and mist-laden neck, convalescing in a hidden stronghold of Howland Reed. She clutched her infant son close, sometimes for hours each day, letting the boy's soft breathing and warmth remind her that not all was lost. At night, she wept quietly for Rhaegar, for the child's precarious place in the world, for her father and Brandon, for the thousands who had died. Sometimes she thought of Robert, her one-time betrothed, and wondered if the rebellion had ever truly been about rescuing her or simply about his hatred for Targaryens. She tried not to let bitterness consume her. The day eventually came when Lyanna could stand without swaying. Her body regained its vitality, and the color began to return to her cheeks. Ned visited whenever he could, but the tasks of rebuilding Winterfell and keeping the North stable demanded most of his attention. Lyanna understood. She had to keep herself hidden if they were to keep Jon safe. The secret was everything. But Lyanna was a wolf of Winterfell. Patience was not her strong suit, and as months turned into a second year, she grew restless. Not a day went by that she did not think of the Iron Throne, where Robert sat so triumphantly. She heard the stories from Ned. The realm was already beginning to show signs of Robert's inattentiveness. The new king found more comfort in hunting, drinking, and indulging than in the small matters of governance. Jon Arryn, the hand of the king, carried the realm on his shoulders, but for how long could that last? The Targaryens in exile, Viserys and infant Daenerys, were said to have fled across the narrow sea, a threat in the future perhaps, but not an immediate one. Lyanna's heart burned with the knowledge that the rightful king, in her mind, had lain dead upon the trident. And here, in her arms, was his son, part Targaryen, part Stark. This boy, whose bloodline might one day challenge the new king, had a claim that could ignite the realm once more. Ned forbade her from speaking of it, from even hinting at it, for fear that Robert would, if he ever learned the truth, see the boy put to the sword. "How can I remain silent?" she asked Ned one eve when he visited. "This is my son. You think Robert would have me hold my tongue forever? That I should never let the realm know Rhaegar's child lives? My child." Ned's voice was gentle but firm. "For your sake, for his sake, yes. Robert would not hesitate to kill him if he suspected a threat to his throne. You know how Robert hates Targaryens. It doesn't matter how many years pass. He still curses Rhaegar's name." Lyanna closed her eyes, steeling her heart against the memory of Robert's face, twisted with anger. She remembered being told after the war how he had smashed Rhaegar's breastplate in on the trident, how he boasted about the rubies scattering into the river. That savage glee. That was not a man she could ever have loved. Time passed, as it is wont to do, bringing with it new burdens. Jon Arryn eventually died under suspicious circumstances in King's Landing. Ned Stark left Winterfell to take up the role of Hand of the King. By then, Lyanna had stealthily moved from the Neck to a more remote corner of the north, hoping to remain undiscovered. She changed her name to Elia, ironically taking on the name of the woman who had once been Rhaegar's wife. She cut her hair shorter and dyed it a shade closer to chestnut, disguising the stark darkness. She rarely ventured outside, refusing to let travelers or passing knights glimpse her face. Howland Reed helped facilitate her moves, ensuring that even the small folk in the hamlets near the swamps did not speak of the woman traveling with a young boy. So the years went on. Jon, as he grew, believed that his mother was a woman named Elia, a friend of House Stark, and that he had no father. He had questions, of course. He was a sharp boy, too sharp for Lyanna's comfort, but she found ways to deflect his curiosity. She taught him about the North, about the old ways, told him stories of the first men and the children of the forest. Sometimes, unable to help herself, she would speak of Rhaegar's passion for music and his love of prophecy. Though she never said the man's name, she portrayed him as a faraway knight of legends, one who had carried a sadness he could not escape. If Jon suspected the truth, he never said so. Lyanna knew Ned had his own burdens at King's Landing. She heard rumors that King Robert grew more drunken and temperamental by the day, that the Queen had grown cunning and had begun weaving webs of her own, that the children Robert claimed to have fathered by Cersei had golden hair instead of black. So many intrigues swirling around the Red Keep. Meanwhile, war brewed on the horizon once more, with rumors that Daenerys Targaryen, the last surviving Targaryen princess, might be married to a Dothraki Khal. Lyanna listened to every shred of news with a heart torn between dread and curiosity. What if Daenerys had a better claim to the Iron Throne than her son Jon? But did that matter at all now, if the realm was doomed to fracture? Then came the tidings of Ned Stark's arrest for treason. Accusations that Ned had discovered some truth about the parentage of Robert's supposed heirs. Robert Baratheon died from a hunting wound not long after. The Lannisters, through the boy Joffrey, had seized the throne. Word reached the far north too late for Lyanna to do anything but sit in stunned horror. Ned was executed on the steps of the Great September of Baelor, they said, before the entire city, before his daughter Sansa. The realm exploded into war. The North named Robb Stark king in the north. Stannis Baratheon and Renly Baratheon both claimed to be rightful kings as well. A storm of swords raged across Westeros, and all the while Lyanna, still in hiding, could only weep for her brother, for the father her son would never truly know. Ned's death changed something in her. A part of her heart, which had clung to hope that Robert might keep the realm stable or that Ned's presence at court might mitigate the worst of King's Landing's deceptions, turned to iron. She had lost her father, her brother Brandon, and now her brother Ned to what she saw as Robert's chain of misjudgments. Had Robert not put Ned in the path of that danger? Had he not surrounded himself with Lannisters who sought to manipulate the throne? Had Robert not enabled the environment that caused her brother's downfall? Her grief hardened into a quiet fury. The war raged on, and though her name was not spoken among the living, Lyanna Stark was done being a ghost. Jon had just turned 8 when she decided they would no longer hide in the north. Too many soldiers were passing through, rumors swirling about wildlings and the king in the north's armies. She feared that the hidden enclaves could no longer be trusted to hold her secret. With Howland Reed's help, she secured passage on a Lyseni merchant galley bound for the free cities. Under the guise of a poor northern widow seeking a new life, she and Jon boarded under false names. They left Westeros behind, perhaps for a season, perhaps forever. Lyanna was not sure. She only knew that she could not watch from afar as the North drowned in Lannister bloodshed. If she was to do something, she needed to ensure Jon's safety first. Across the narrow sea, they drifted through the sun-baked cities of Essos. In Pentos, she heard whispers of Daenerys Targaryen's growing power among the Dothraki. She heard how the dragon princess had hatched 3 dragons in the Red Waste, how she had freed thousands of slaves in Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen. And with every rumor, Lyanna's blood quickened. This was the sister of Rhaegar, aunt to Jon. If she truly commanded dragons, then a new era might be dawning. The Targaryen name rose once more to prominence, as if the dragons were reawakening. At night, when Jon slept, Lyanna recalled the hush of the Tower of Joy. She recalled Rhaegar's unwavering belief in a prophecy about a prince who was promised, about a song of ice and fire. She never fully understood the prophecy, but she felt its resonance in her bones. Part of her wondered if Daenerys might be that promised one, or if the prophecy spoke of her own child. If the realm was to be turned upside down again, she wanted to at least be certain that her family's legacy, Stark, Targaryen, or both, had a say in it. Lyanna was no fool. She had grown cunning in her years of hiding, forging alliances with sellswords, using hidden caches of valuables that Ned had sent her through Howland Reed, bartering in the free markets of Lys and Bravos. She adopted new manners, learned new tongues, and taught Jon to read High Valyrian in secret, for she believed it was part of his birthright. She told him to keep his identity hidden, at least for now. He obeyed, though his curiosity grew with each passing year. Sometimes, she would catch him staring at her with those gray eyes, so like her own, and she would see the question there, unspoken. Who am I truly? When word reached them in Pentos that King in the North Robb Stark had been murdered at the Twins during the infamous Red Wedding, Lyanna locked herself away for a full day, tears carving trails of salt down her cheeks. She had never met Robb. He was born after the war, just a babe when she was hidden away. Still, he was her nephew, another Stark lost to the Game of Thrones. For House Stark, the tragedies seemed endless. Lyanna steeled her resolve once more. She told herself it was time to move again, perhaps traveling east to see if the rumors of Daenerys' conquests were true. But before she could do so, she received a visitor. Varys the Spider, the master of whisperers once in King's Landing, or so he introduced himself. His shaved head and soft steps unnerved her, and though she tried to hide her identity, Varys gently let her know he was aware of who she was or had been. "My dear lady," he said in that soft, unctuous voice, "I have no wish to harm you. On the contrary, I have a proposition, one that might appeal to your sense of justice. The realm is in chaos, as you no doubt know, and our new king, or rather Queen Cersei Lannister, has grown quite mad. She's a lioness cornered, lashing out at all around her. The Iron Throne is a tinderbox, Lady Lyanna, waiting for the right spark to set it aflame, and I believe you carry a spark of your own." Lyanna's blood pounded. Fear mingled with intrigue. "I have no spark to offer. The realm is hardly going to follow the command of a dead woman." Varys smiled. "That would be true were you alone. But you are not alone, my lady, are you? You carry with you something far more valuable than gold or steel. You carry a legacy." His eyes flicked to the other room, where Jon was likely asleep. "I would not presume to speak further, unless I had your leave, but I believe, if we are to free the realm from Lannister tyranny, you may wish to consider that the realm needs uniting. Needs a rightful lineage." Anger sparked in her. "He's just a boy," she said, voice hushed. "He's barely old enough to hold a sword, and yet he has a name," said Varys, "that might unite Targaryen loyalists and those in the north who remain disillusioned after the Red Wedding. Perhaps, with your guidance, that name might bring the realm together in a more just manner than either the Lannisters or the late King Robert ever could." Lyanna wanted to rage at him, wanted to chase him out of her humble lodging, but she found she could not. The truth was, she had dreamed of a world where her son could claim his father's birthright, or even just live openly without fear of a blade in his back. But the risk was enormous. "Daenerys Targaryen is alive," she told Varys. "She has dragons. The word is spreading." Varys's expression shifted. "She does indeed, and she grows in power with each city she frees. But power in Essos does not easily translate to power in Westeros. If and when she crosses the narrow sea, she will face armies that might not welcome her as a liberator. If your son's existence were known, that might be cause for strife, or it could be a cause for unity, if you choose to act wisely. The last thing we want is Targaryen kin fighting each other for the throne, you understand." He left Lyanna that evening with a swirl of perfumed robes, promising to contact her again should she wish it. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the window, gazing at the flickering lamps in the street below, wondering if it was her destiny to remain a ghost, or if she was meant to be a wolf once more. It was Jon who drove her decision in the end. He was no longer a toddler. He was near enough to manhood in these times of turmoil, especially for Westerosi standards. He had grown lean and tall, with hair so dark it was almost black, and eyes that carried a solemn weight. Whenever he practiced with a wooden sword, he showed promise. His reflexes were swift and his stance gradually improved. But there was a gentleness in him too, one that reminded her of Ned, and if anything, that made her love him all the more. One night, she sat him down. By candlelight, she told him part of the truth, enough so he'd understand that he was not truly her bastard in the sense the world assumed. She told him that he was of noble blood, that his father had been a great man loved by many, that his father had died in a war. She said that one day he might have a chance to set right some of the wrongs that war had created. She apologized for the deception and asked his forgiveness. The boy was stunned, as she knew he would be, but he listened with that quiet, thoughtful stare of his. Am I a Stark?" he asked, almost timidly. Lyanna closed her eyes, heart throbbing. "In part," she said. "You have Stark blood in you and Targaryen. Your father was Rhaegar Targaryen, the Prince of Dragonstone, rightful heir to the Iron Throne, if you believe such lineages matter. But the world does not know you exist. And if you reveal yourself, there will be those who want you dead. You must be sure before you decide how to live." His face grew serious, even fearful. "Targaryen," he repeated. He looked at her again, as if seeing her anew. Then, "Who are you?" "I am Lyanna Stark," she said, voice trembling with emotion as she spoke her own name aloud to her son for the first time. sister to Eddard, Brandon, and Benjen, daughter to Ricard. Your mother. He took time to process it all, the flicker of the candle playing across his features. Then he asked, "What do you want me to do?" Lyanna's eyes brimmed with tears she refused to shed. "I want you to live. I want you to have a choice. The throne, if it even matters, doesn't have to be your destiny. Daenerys Targaryen may claim it, or the Baratheons, or some other might wear the crown. Westeros is in chaos, and crowns can be curses. All I ask is that you make your choices with eyes open, knowing who you are." Jon nodded, swallowing hard. The flicker of something, pride, longing, shone in his eyes. "I'll do what is right," he said finally. "For our family." That simple promise gave Lyanna the strength she needed. She left Pentos soon after, ironically traveling to Meereen, where Daenerys Targaryen had established her seat of power. The city was rife with internal tensions, harried by sons of the former masters who waged guerrilla war against the Queen's Unsullied. But Daenerys was said to be forging alliances with new forces, Daario Naharis, Tyrion Lannister, who had apparently joined her cause after fleeing King's Landing, Grey Worm, and others. If any place might welcome the revelation of Rhaegar's hidden son, it would be Meereen, where the last Targaryen ruler had taken root. Under the guidance of Varys's quiet whisper network, Lyanna arrived with Jon on a quiet morning. They were granted an audience with the Queen, Daenerys Stormborn, Mother of Dragons, Breaker of Chains, titles that made Lyanna's head spin as they were announced. Tyrion Lannister stood at the Queen's side, his mismatched gaze full of curiosity. Ser Barristan Selmy was there as well, the old knight who had once served the Kingsguard under Aerys and then Robert. His eyes widened the moment Lyanna announced who she was. The Queen's expression was carefully guarded, especially when Lyanna knelt and then gently guided Jon to kneel as well. Lyanna felt her heart thundering in her chest. "Your Grace," she said, her voice taut with tension. "My name is Lyanna Stark, though I have lived under false names for many years. With me is my son, born of Rhaegar Targaryen before the final battle of Robert's rebellion. He lives, and his name is Jon." Those assembled in the throne room, noble Meereenese, Sellsword captains, advisors, collectively gasped or muttered. Daenerys's violet eyes went wide, flicking from Lyanna to Jon. She looked almost hurt. "Rhaegar's child? We were told his children were murdered in King's Landing." Tyrion stepped forward, brow wrinkled. "How is this possible? I recall the rumors, the stories of Princess Elia's children being slain. That monster Gregor Clegane. But if you are claiming to be Rhaegar's paramour..." "Rhaegar was never fond of the term paramour," Lyanna said tightly. "But yes, I was his lover, and we married in secret under the old rites, if you choose to believe it. I was promised to Robert Baratheon, but I refused that match when I learned what kind of man he truly was." Lyanna chose not to detail the subtle cruelties she'd seen in Robert's attitude toward Targaryens or the rest of it. "My son is of his blood, and you, your Grace, are his aunt." Daenerys stared at Jon with a mixture of awe and suspicion. "If you speak truth, then he is my blood indeed. Yet I have never heard anything of this from any who survived those days. Even Ser Barristan." She turned to the white-haired knight, whose face was pale with memory. Ser Barristan bowed. "My queen, if you will recall, I once told you that your brother Rhaegar was capable of great love, though he was wed to Elia Martell. There were rumors that he sought an annulment or a second marriage. I heard only fragments, but I knew he took an interest in Lyanna Stark. Some whispered that he abducted her. Others said she went willingly. I was too young then to know the truth, and the war consumed us all too quickly." He turned his gaze upon Lyanna and Jon. "But I see Lord Eddard Stark in her face, and some Targaryen aspect in the boy's eyes." Daenerys's lips parted in a soft exhale. "If you are indeed Rhaegar's son, then what do you want of me?" Jon looked to his mother, uncertain. Lyanna felt her throat tighten. "We have come so you might know the truth, and so that I might pledge whatever help we can give in your cause. If your cause is truly just. The Lannisters hold the Iron Throne. They have killed my family, sowed chaos throughout the realm. Robert Baratheon allowed them power, and his absence from rule gave them the chance to strangle Westeros. You are Rhaegar's sister. My son is Rhaegar's heir. I would see the realm freed of Lannister tyranny, and I believe you would as well. If you plan to sail west to claim your birthright, we would stand at your side." There was silence in the hall, broken only by the distant cry of one of the dragons perched atop the Great Pyramid. Then Daenerys stepped down from her seat and came before Jon. She raised a hand and Jon, tentative, met her gaze. Lyanna could see the swirl of questions in Daenerys's eyes. Anger at the secrets withheld, sorrow at the lost years, curiosity about this nephew she never knew existed. Then the queen placed a gentle hand on Jon's cheek. "I am the mother of dragons," Daenerys said softly. "But once, I was only a frightened girl with a cruel brother who sold me to the Dothraki. I have endured betrayal, loss, and heartbreak, yet I have found my strength in the people who choose to stand beside me. If you are my blood, I will not turn you away, but you must prove to me you are who you say. That proof lies not in words alone, but in your actions and, if necessary, in the testimonies of men like Howland Reed or others who saw the union of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen. I will not be deceived, nor will I wantonly kill those who come with claims of kinship. Show me your loyalty, Jon, and you shall have mine." Lyanna felt a tear slip free, relief warring with lingering wariness. "We will do whatever is required, your grace. My only wish is to see an end to the Lannisters' hold on the throne, and to keep my son safe." And so it was that Lyanna Stark aligned herself with Daenerys Targaryen in Meereen. It was not an easy alliance. Many of the freedmen distrusted any Westerosi, let alone a woman claiming ties to the Dragon Lords. Some of the queen's advisors fretted about the rightful succession. If Rhaegar's son lived, did that weaken Daenerys's claim? Daenerys herself sometimes gazed at Jon with an expression of distant sadness, perhaps reminded of the brother she'd never known beyond stories. Tyrion Lannister was polite to Lyanna, but she could sense his mind always whirring, analyzing how this new presence might shift the game. In time, proof was assembled. Varys produced accounts from individuals in the north and in the Riverlands who claimed knowledge of Ned Stark's finding Lyanna alive. Howland Reed wrote a private letter, testifying in detail about the Tower of Joy, about Rhaegar's child, about the oath Ned took. Ser Barristan, after some reflection, confirmed that Rhaegar had confided in him once about a secret that might change the realm, a secret he'd never fully understood. The more evidence came to light, the more Daenerys accepted it. Yet she insisted that if they were to present themselves as Targaryens before the realm, there had to be unity, not rivalry. Because if we are divided, Cersei will exploit it, Daenerys told them in private. She thrives on division. She will feed rumors that this young boy, Jon, is a usurper to my claim, or that you, Lyanna, are lying to gain power. She will say anything to keep her throne. Lyanna nodded, though she couldn't entirely quell the flicker of hope in her breast. Was it truly best for Daenerys to take the throne if Jon was the actual heir? Rhaegar had been the heir before the war, and by all accounts that made Jon the rightful heir after him. But was that best for Westeros? Daenerys had the dragons. The small folk might rally behind her. Jon was still a boy, albeit a promising one. For now, Lyanna kept these thoughts to herself, letting the Targaryen siblings, aunt and nephew, bond in their own manner. Daenerys eventually gathered her forces to sail for Westeros. The fleet took shape with ships from the Ironborn loyal to Yara Greyjoy, from the Dornish who still smoldered with hatred for the Lannisters, from the Reach Lords who had turned against Cersei. Lyanna and Jon found themselves on the same vessel as Tyrion Lannister and Missandei of Noth, crossing the narrow sea that had separated them from their homeland for so long. Lyanna spent the voyage on the deck sometimes, gazing westward, thinking of Winterfell, of the crypts beneath the castle where her statue presumably stood, marking her death. She would not remain a ghost. The time had come to act. She was still a Stark after all, and the wolves of Winterfell did not cower forever. Upon making landfall at Dragonstone, the ancient seat of House Targaryen, Daenerys set about establishing a foothold. The castle was in partial disrepair, lightly manned but formidable in design. Lyanna could barely contain the chill that ran through her when she stepped onto the black stone walls, shaped by Valyrian sorcery centuries ago. She had never seen Dragonstone before, yet she felt a twinge of belonging and an echo of fear. So much Targaryen history, so much blood spilled over the years. Was this truly the path to a better realm? Or just another link in a chain of violence? Jon was in awe of everything. The dragons swooping overhead, the exotic armies from across the sea, the stony halls lined with carvings of dragons. Lyanna watched him carefully, her maternal instincts prickling whenever the boy ventured close to one of Daenerys's colossal beasts. Yet surprisingly, Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion, the last still alive at that time, allowed him near enough to feel their hot breath. Sometimes they'd hiss or chuff, but they never attacked him. Perhaps there was a sense of shared blood between them. Daenerys noticed it too, though she said little. As word spread that Daenerys Targaryen had landed in Westeros with an army, Queen Cersei in King's Landing bristled, calling upon all the lords still loyal to her to rally. The Crownlands, many of the Westerlands, and some parts of the Reach answered the call. Euron Greyjoy, newly allied with Cersei, harried Daenerys's naval forces. The sands of Dorne seethed with the thirst for vengeance, while the north was in chaos, with Winterfell in the hands of the Boltons. Roose Bolton had been named Warden of the North, and his bastard son Ramsay was rumored to be committing atrocities. Sansa Stark had apparently fled or been married off. Bran and Rickon Stark were presumed dead. Arya Stark's fate was unknown. There were too many tragedies for Lyanna to contemplate. She wanted to race to Winterfell to see if any of her kin still drew breath. But Daenerys insisted that they needed a strategy. That strategy came partly from Tyrion Lannister, partly from the cunning of Varys, and partly from the quiet counsel Lyanna offered in the war councils. She refused to stand idly by. Each time plans were made, she insisted on hearing them, though she kept her identity concealed from most of Daenerys's allies. "Your name is not widely known," Tyrion cautioned. "If you appear before the lords of Westeros, proclaiming yourself Lyanna Stark returned from the grave, many will doubt you, some will call you a fraud. The Boltons won't hesitate to send assassins. The Lannisters and their allies might do the same." "I have lived in secrecy long enough," Lyanna replied. "If we want the North to rally to Daenerys or to us, we must show them a Stark lives. They don't trust Targaryens. They never have. But they might trust one of their own." In the end, the first blow came in the form of a letter. Lyanna personally penned a Raven's message to every major northern house still resisting the Boltons, and to those southern houses that once counted themselves true friends of House Stark: House Manderly, House Glover, House Serwyn, House Reed. The letter bore the seal of the direwolf, along with a simple statement: "Lyanna Stark lives. The Boltons are traitors. The true king in the north is gone. But Ned Stark's sister stands with Daenerys Targaryen to restore honor and justice." She did not mention Jon in these letters. He was still a child and a vital secret weapon. Let them focus on her if they chose not to believe. Let them wonder. The realm would hear soon enough. Caused an uproar. People gawked at the notion that Ned Stark's dead sister had somehow survived. The Boltons declared it a ploy, a southern trick. But some lords, especially the Manderleys and Howland Reed's Crannogmen, took it seriously. Howland Reed confirmed it, and that made lords across the neck prick up their ears. The Manderleys, with their wealth and resources, quietly pledged men to the Targaryen cause, waiting for a chance to strike at the Boltons and retake Winterfell in the name of the Starks. While this political dance played out, Daenerys pressed her advantage in the south. She unleashed her Dothraki horde on the fields of the Reach, smashing a Lannister supply convoy. She demanded the surrender of those who had once sworn loyalty to the crown. Dragons soared above them, a living embodiment of Targaryen might. Some bent the knee, others resisted and were scorched for their defiance. Lyanna watched from afar, her stomach twisting in knots. She had never desired to see the fields of Westeros burned by dragonfire. But war, it seemed, did not bow to anyone's gentler hopes. Still, she reminded herself that Robert Baratheon's reign had led to the deaths of her kin. The Lannisters had spilled Stark blood again and again. If anyone deserved the wrath of dragons, it was Cersei and her minions. Jon, for his part, was resolute. He hated seeing men burned alive, even if they were enemies. He pulled at Lyanna's sleeve one day after news reached them of hundreds roasted on a battlefield near the Blackwater Rush. "Mother," he whispered, voice husky with emotion, "is this truly the way to help the realm?" Father would not have. He stopped himself, looking away, ashamed perhaps to invoke Ned's name. Lyanna stroked his hair. "I know this is a hard truth, Jon, but war spares no one. Our best hope is to end it quickly, to overthrow Cersei so the realm might know peace. Then perhaps no more fields need burn." Jon nodded solemnly, though the sight of him grappling with this ugliness tore at her heart. Bit by bit, Daenerys tightened her noose around King's Landing. Meanwhile, the North rose up under the leadership of the Manderleys and other loyalist houses, spurred on by the rumor that Lyanna Stark was alive. They rebelled against the Boltons, who had become even more brutal in an attempt to quash dissent. In a fierce confrontation outside Winterfell's walls, the Bolton forces broke. Ramsay was slain, Roose captured and later executed on Daenerys' command, an order that Lyanna urged, given House Bolton's long history of treachery against House Stark. The banners of the direwolf were raised above the battlements, and Lyanna Stark walked once more beneath the gatehouse of her childhood home. She did so with Daenerys at her side. The day they arrived, the skies threatened snow, and the Northmen lined the battlements in curiosity and awe. Many recognized Lyanna's face, older, yes, but undeniably Stark. She wore her hair loose to show its dark color, wore a cloak of white fur. The cheers that went up were for her name as much as for the new Targaryen queen. Lyanna felt tears in her eyes as she re-entered the great hall, stepping on the very stones where her father once sat, where her brother Ned once doled out justice. The ghosts were thick in every corner. She could almost see Ned's solemn smile, hear Brandon's laughter, feel her father's proud gaze. Yet she had little time to dwell on the past. Daenerys meant to hold court in Winterfell, to demand fealty from the northern lords. Some bent the knee willingly, grateful to be free of the Boltons. Others held their tongues, suspicious of Targaryens bearing dragons. When they saw Lyanna, some of that suspicion faded, for she was proof that House Stark itself supported Daenerys. Lyanna took that role seriously, even as the haunted memories of her youth swirled around her. Jon wore Stark colors for the first time as he walked these halls. He had only known them through stories, but the North welcomed him warmly, though no one realized his full parentage. They only knew him as Lyanna Stark's son, a detail that was cause for hushed wonder. Some whispered that Ned Stark must have hidden his sister away, that she had borne a bastard in secret. A few disapproved, but many saw it as a testament to the old wolf's loyalty to family. And though Jon was only a boy, he carried himself with quiet honor, which won him more acceptance than he might have otherwise received. Winterfell became the forward base for Daenerys' final push south. A thickening alliance took shape. The Vale, newly led by the boy Robert Arryn under the guidance of Lord Peter Baelish, hesitated, but eventually promised support once the Targaryen forces moved on King's Landing. The Riverlands were still torn between various lords' loyalties, but a strong faction under House Tully, newly rescued from the frays, leaned toward Daenerys' side. The Ironborn under Yara had waged war on Euron, fracturing the Iron Islands' forces. During those winter days at Winterfell, Lyanna made a point to visit the crypts alone. She knelt before the statues of her father and mother, before the effigies of Brandon and Ned, lighting a candle for each. She found her own statue, which startled her. A carved likeness, not perfect, but enough to show that the Starks had truly believed her gone. She traced her fingers over the stony cheek, trembling with emotion. Flowers had been placed there once, likely by Ned in his guilt or sorrow. The statue wore an expression of solemn repose. She wondered if she should shatter it to mark her return to life, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was the knowledge that she would never be the same girl who had once laughed and spun across the training yard. That girl was dead in a sense. She had been reborn as a woman who carried secrets, who carried the burden of a child that might claim the throne. Better to let that stone effigy remain, a reminder of the price paid for war. In the weeks that followed, News came north that King's Landing was in turmoil. The population starved, the gold stores had run out, and Cersei was rumored to be making alliances with vile mercenary companies across the sea. The time for the final battle approached, but Daenerys hesitated, wanting to ensure the North was secure before leaving. She recognized that the White Walkers, an ancient threat rumored beyond the Wall, might also pose a danger. The uneasy alliances in the North needed to be solidified. The Lords wanted a Stark to remain in Winterfell as Warden of the North, or some such. Lyanna sat in council with Daenerys and her advisors. Daenerys proposed that Lyanna stay in Winterfell to rule in her stead, preserving northern loyalty while she took her dragons and armies south. Lyanna was tempted, for she had never wanted to see more bloodshed, but part of her also longed to see the Lannisters toppled, to see justice done for Ned, for her father, for all the Starks lost. Then Jon spoke. He stood before the Queen, though overshadowed by the presence of Grey Worm, Tyrion, and others. "If you are to face Cersei," he said, voice steady, "then let my mother go with you. Let her bear the Stark name in your cause. The North shall see that House Stark and House Targaryen are truly allied, not just in words. I will stay in Winterfell. I will keep the peace here, or do my best until you return." Lyanna looked at him in surprise. "Jon, you're too young." But Daenerys lifted a hand. "He's old enough to hold a keep, especially with the guidance of the loyal Northern Lords. Let them see how a child of House Stark is nurtured. With a council of regents, perhaps Wyman Manderly, Howland Reed, and others, he may do just fine." She turned to Lyanna, her face thoughtful. "Your presence would be valuable on the battlefield, to rally the Northern Knights who marched with us, and to show them a Stark is among our ranks. You know these lands, these people, better than I ever could." And so it was decided. Lyanna wrestled with her maternal instincts, but in the end, she agreed. Jon would remain behind, protected by those loyal to House Stark. She would march south with Daenerys and her dragons, forging a direct path to King's Landing. They would do what Robert Baratheon had done years ago, but in reverse, they would unseat a tyrant Fr. The Iron Throne. Lyanna's final night in Winterfell was marked by a chill wind that howled around the towers. She embraced Jon fiercely before departing. He clung to her, fear shining in his eyes. "Mother," he whispered, "please be safe." She forced a smile. "I survived the Tower of Joy, Jon. I survived Robert's rebellion. I will survive this too." He nodded, swallowing the tears. "I'll be here waiting." She left him standing in the courtyard, flanked by the men who would protect him, and rode out with Daenerys' host at dawn. Their banners fluttered in the cold morning air. The three-headed dragon of Targaryen, the dire wolf of Stark. It struck Lyanna as bitterly ironic that she rode beneath these sigils in unison. Wasn't it the union of wolf and dragon that had brought ruin to the realm once before? But perhaps this time it might bring salvation. The armies marched south, passing the ruins of Moat Cailin, crossing the Neck. Some lords joined them along the way, swelling their ranks. The uneasy alliances that had formed over the months now coalesced into a proper fighting force. Daenerys kept her dragons near, using them to strike fear into any who dared muster an army in the Crownlands. Cersei was said to be frantic, dispatching riders and ravens across the realm to gather men to defend the capital. The gold from Highgarden was lost, the Tyrells in open rebellion. The city's gates swelled with refugees, and the peasants whispered that a new Targaryen queen was coming to burn them all. By the time Daenerys' forces neared the outskirts of King's Landing, Cersei had taken refuge in the Red Keep, forging some devil's pact with Euron Greyjoy. The Lannister army was battered, exhausted, but still dangerous. Their commander, a grim-faced man rumored to be the resurrected Hulk of Gregor Clegane, roamed the corridors of the castle, executing any who spoke of surrender. Lyanna stood on a ridge overlooking King's Landing as the host prepared for siege. The city spread out before her, an ocean of red-tiled roofs, with the black-watered bay shimmering in the distance. Smoke rose from some neighborhoods where riots had broken out. She could practically smell the fear wafting over the walls. She remembered Robert's rebellion, how the city was spared from Ares's wildfire only at the last moment. Now, ironically, Targaryen banners flew outside those same walls, demanding the city's surrender. She gripped the reins of her horse, heart pounding. Would it all end in flames again? Daenerys tried one last time to offer terms of surrender. She sent Tyrion to parley with Cersei to no avail. The next morning, siege engines rumbled forward, archers readied on both sides, and the dragons circled overhead. The city's defenders shot scorpion bolts at them, but few found their marks. A hush fell over the battlefield as Daenerys soared on Drogon, unleashing dragonfire on the city's gates. The gates buckled and crashed, sending defenders scattering. Thousands of men poured into the city, clashing in bloody street fighting. Lyanna rode with the northern cavalry at Daenerys' side, though she took no joy in the slaughter. Civilians screamed and fled, smoke choked the alleyways, and the wails of the dying filled the air. She tried to rally the men to keep discipline, to avoid the wanton rapes and pillaging that so often accompanied a city's sacking. Daenerys had commanded the same, but in the chaos of war, not all men listened. Lyanna saw Lannister soldiers stabbing at unarmed peasants, Northerners returning the favor with savage fury. She felt ill, but pressed on, forging toward the Red Keep. Atop the keep's battlements, Cersei stood in her black gown, flanked by her monstrous guard. Her face was pale but resolute, as if she intended to die where she stood. Daenerys landed Drogon in the courtyard below the walls, roaring a challenge. Lyanna dismounted and stood among the swirling ash and dust, watching as hundreds of men approached the gates of the keep, prepared to break them down if necessary. Then the gates opened. A small retinue in Lannister crimson emerged, weapons lowered. It was Jaime Lannister at their head, face grim, golden hand glinting in the dull light. He had turned against Cersei at the final moment, it seemed, refusing to let the city burn. Beside him walked some of the city guard. They surrendered their swords to Daenerys' forces, and Jaime demanded that Cersei stand down to avoid further bloodshed. She refused to listen, Jaime said hoarsely. But she has lost. The bells are ringing. Indeed, the city's bells tolled in the distance, calling for surrender. I beg you, call off the attack. Show mercy, not for her sake, but for the people's. Lyanna stepped forward, ignoring the swirl of men around her. She gazed up at Cersei on the battlement, seeing a proud, broken queen whose cruelty had stained the realm. This was the woman who had orchestrated Ned's death, who had done nothing to halt the horrors that befell House Stark. The weight of all that grief bore down on Lyanna like a black tide. But she remembered her vow not to see the city burned, not to become the monster that Ares had been. She gripped the hilt of her sword, forced the rage to subside, and called out, "Come down from there, Cersei Lannister. The war is lost. Surrender now, and perhaps you can live out the remainder of your days in a cell to answer for what you've done." Cersei stared down at them, eyes flicking from Daenerys to Lyanna. A tremor coursed through her. Then she gestured. The monstrous figure of the undead Gregor Clegane loomed behind her. But Jaime stepped forward, grappling with the beast. Cersei stumbled back from the parapet, out of sight. Daenerys gave the order, and her men flooded the Red Keep. It fell in a matter of hours. The throne room was seized. The remnants of the Lannister guard either fled or died in the corridors. Cersei, cornered, was found near the Iron Throne, shivering in a delirium of denial and terror. Grey Worm dragged her before Daenerys, who stood among the shattered columns and charred tapestries, Drogon's silhouette blackening the open roof. The Queen of the Seven Kingdoms had fallen. The city had surrendered, though fires burned in several quarters. It was over. Robert Baratheon's kingdom, the Lannisters' hold on the throne, the illusions that had persisted for years. In that final moment, Lyanna stared at the Iron Throne. It was a twisted, jagged thing, forged from 1,000 blades, the seat of so much bloodshed. Cersei knelt in forced submission before Daenerys. The hush was palpable. Daenerys raised her chin, scanning the hall. Her eyes flicked to Lyanna, who stood to one side, battered, exhausted. caked in soot and dust. "People of King's Landing," Daenerys declared in a voice that echoed through the broken throne room, "the war is done. Cersei Lannister has fallen. I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, your rightful queen. I grant you mercy, and I swear to you that I will not be the tyrant you have endured. I will bring justice." She glanced at Lyanna. Lyanna stepped forward, drawing a breath. She felt the eyes of thousands upon her, the ghosts of her family urging her on. "I am Lyanna Stark," she said, her voice tight. "Many of you believed me dead. Robert Baratheon's war cast a long shadow, and the Lannisters have ruled with cruelty ever since. I stand with Queen Daenerys Targaryen because she offers a new beginning for this realm, an end to bloodshed. The North stands with her." The hush deepened. Then, slowly, some of Daenerys's men began to cheer. The freedmen from Essos, the Dothraki, the Unsullied, the Northern soldiers, and the rebellious lords from the Reach all raised their voices. The city guards, the battered Lannister loyalists, and the frightened small folk cowered or looked on with wary relief. The clamor grew until the throne room rang with it. Though it was no easy thing to unify a broken realm, though it would take years of toil and negotiation, at that moment the realm saw a vision of the possibility of peace. Daenerys had her throne. Lyanna Stark had avenged her family. And somewhere in the north, Jon waited in Winterfell, the living embodiment of wolf and dragon both. In the weeks that followed, Daenerys set about restoring order, punishing the worst of the Lannisters' loyalists. But she remembered the vow to show mercy to the small folk. Cersei was imprisoned, to be tried for her crimes. Some clamored for her execution, others for exile. Daenerys listened to her counsel carefully. Lyanna weighed in, reminding them that her own father had once sought mercy for a mad king's family, and it had led to a complicated war. In the end, Daenerys sentenced Cersei to spend the rest of her days in the Silent Sisters' custody, a living humiliation for the once proud queen. Tyrion remained at Daenerys' side, serving as Hand of the Queen, despite his internal conflicts about his sister's fate. Through it all, Lyanna observed that the Iron Throne truly was a burden. Daenerys wrestled with the day-to-day governance, the demands of rebuilding a city half-burnt and fully traumatized. The realm was far from stable. Many lords resented Targaryen rule or demanded special privileges. The Vale still hovered in the background, uncertain. The Riverlands simmered with old rivalries. The North, for now, seemed content to stay loyal, especially with a Stark, Lyanna, so close to the Queen's side. But winter was creeping in, bringing the threat of White Walkers rumored beyond the wall. One day, after the worst of the devastation in the city had been cleared, Daenerys asked Lyanna to walk with her through the throne room. The jagged pillars were being repaired, the cracks in the floor patched. The Iron Throne still stood at the far end, an ugly silhouette. The Queen said, "I have claimed my birthright, but what of yours, my lady? Rhaegar was the rightful heir once, so by all laws, your son Jon might have a stronger claim than I do. Have you never thought to seat him on the throne?" Lyanna stopped. Her heart beat painfully as she looked upon the throne that had cost so many lives. "I did," she admitted softly. "When I first came to you, I wondered if that might be his destiny. But after seeing all this bloodshed, I realize I want something else for him." Daenerys inclined her head. "And what is that?" "A life without the weight of a crown," Lyanna said. "If he chooses to serve the realm one day, so be it, but it should be his choice." Rhaegar believed in prophecies, in grand destinies. Perhaps he was right. But the destinies we choose for ourselves can be far kinder. Daenerys reached out and grasped Lyanna's hand gently. "Then he shall have that choice. I will not press a crown upon his head unless he seeks it. The realm has had enough of forced kings and queens. Let us find a new way, together." Lyanna felt a rush of gratitude. The memory of Rhaegar's silver-haired visage flickered in her mind, along with Ned's solemn frown, Robert's booming laugh, and Brandon's teasing grin. So many pieces of the past had led her here. She found herself breathing more easily than she had in years. So it was that Lyanna Stark stood beside Daenerys Targaryen in the great hall of the Red Keep when the lords and ladies of Westeros came to bow before their new queen. She watched the scrolls of edict being read, the kneeling lords swearing fealty or at least acceptance. She saw Gendry Baratheon, newly legitimized, forging a path of his own. She saw Tyrion guiding the realm's finances, Ser Davos quietly negotiating truces, Brienne of Tarth forging alliances. In time, she traveled north again, bearing news and supplies to Winterfell. She found Jon in the Godswood, kneeling by the heart tree, the faint swirl of snow dancing around him. He looked up at her approach. She noticed how he had grown in her absence, how he carried himself with a certain quiet leadership, the way Ned once did. She knelt beside him, felt the rough bark of the weirwood under her palm, and together they prayed, to the old gods, to the new, to whatever power might grant them a moment of peace. When they rose, Jon took her hand. "You've done it," he said, though there was a tremor in his voice. "Queen Daenerys sits the Iron Throne. The Lannisters are toppled. Are we safe now?" Lyanna gazed at her son, remembering her own youth, how she once believed Robert's rebellion would fix the realm's ills. "Safer, perhaps," she said gently, "but there's always another threat on the horizon. The only thing we can do is face it together." Jon nodded. Then his eyes slid to the side, to the tombs where the Stark dead were laid to rest. "Mother, I've been thinking. Once things settle, I'd like to journey beyond the wall, see the free folk, learn more about these White Walkers we keep hearing rumors of. I feel a pull to the north." "Is that foolish?" She squeezed his hand. "No, we Starks are of the north. If that's what your heart tells you, then follow it. Just be careful. Take men you trust. The wall can be dangerous." He smiled faintly. "Thank you." They left the Godswood as the snow drifted lazily around them. The light of the setting sun painted the courtyard in gold and crimson. Lyanna looked upon Winterfell's towers, upon the north's wide sky, and felt a cautious hope stirring in her chest. She was no longer a hidden ghost. She was Lyanna Stark, a woman who had opposed Robert Baratheon's tyranny by surviving it, who had helped overthrow the Lannister stranglehold. She had found a queen to believe in, one who listened to counsel and sought to break the wheel, not merely sit upon it. And she had protected her son, the living link between the dragons of Targaryen and the wolves of Stark. She knew the future was uncertain. Wars might come again, or the White Walkers might descend, or new threats could arise from across the seas. But for the first time in decades, Lyanna Stark felt free. And that freedom was worth every sacrifice, every secret kept, every tear shed in the shadows. She would walk openly in the world, head held high, no longer the stolen bride, no longer the silent sister. So ended the reign of Robert Baratheon and the tyranny of the Lannisters, toppled by a Targaryen queen and a Stark who refused to remain a memory in a cold crypt. Lyanna had survived, and in surviving had set a new course for the Seven Kingdoms. Whether it would be a gentler course or lead again to war was a riddle for the years to come, but for now the realm had a fighting chance at peace. And that, Lyanna thought, was all she had ever truly wanted. Lyanna Stark stood beside Daenerys Targaryen in the courtyard of Winterfell, fresh snow clinging to the ends of her dark hair, while the queen's white blonde braids caught the morning light. Only days had passed since their triumphant return from King's Landing. The city had fallen, the Lannisters were vanquished or in chains, and the Iron Throne now belonged to Daenerys Stormborn. Yet Lyanna knew that crowning a queen was not the same as securing a realm. The fields outside the walls still housed thousands of soldiers, Dothraki, Unsullied, Northmen, and men from the Reach and the Stormlands. They milled about in uneasy commingling, separated by language and custom. And the snow continued to drift from the sky, an unceasing reminder that winter pressed on. She drew her fur cloak closer around her shoulders and glanced at Jon, who stood to her right. He had grown taller in her absence, and there was a quiet steadiness in him that always reminded her of Ned. He had just turned 13 by the turn of the year, on the cusp of manhood by northern standards. Though he had never lived in Winterfell before Daenerys' conquest, in the months since they had reclaimed the castle from the Boltons, he had begun to find his place among the North's people. They called him Lord Jon, or simply the Stark Boy. not fully understanding how he could exist if Lyanna had supposedly died decades before. Daenerys descended the steps, her posture poised as she surveyed the half-frozen yard. In the corner, Grey Worm spoke with a handful of Unsullied about their watch rotations. Near the main gate, Dothraki warriors huddled around fires, stamping their feet for warmth they were ill-accustomed to needing. Some of the northern soldiers gazed at those riders with open suspicion, while others simply kept to themselves. Lyanna could see Tyrion Lannister across the yard, talking quietly with Ser Davos. Tensions were inevitable. Forging a new peace would demand more than a mere victory in battle. Yet Daenerys's gaze remained resolute. "We must hold council," she said, glancing to Lyanna and Jon. "Bring the northern lords, the Stormland men, and any others who wish to speak on the matter of next steps. War in the south is done, but war in the north may still lie ahead." She needn't specify what she meant. Word had spread of whites and White Walkers stirring beyond the wall. Few had seen them, but the rumors were persistent, carried by wildlings, free folk, who had scattered southward over the last few years. Lyanna recalled well the heart tree's whispers and the ancient songs about the long night. Winter was no longer just a season, but a threat on the horizon. Within the hour, the great hall of Winterfell filled with people. Braziers crackled, and the thick gray stones glowed with the light of many torches. At the high table, Daenerys took the seat traditionally meant for the lord of the castle. Lyanna sat at her right hand. Tyrion, as Hand of the Queen, sat on her left. A hush fell over the hall as more lords arrived. Lord Wyman Manderly, tall and broad, with a belly that marked his love of good food and good humor. Lord Glover, his face still lined with bitterness after the sufferings his house had endured under the Boltons. Howland Reed, who had left his marshy stronghold in the Neck to stand beside his longtime allies, and a scattering of knights and bannermen from the south, uncertain in this cold place but determined to support their queen. Jon perched on a seat further down the table, out of the direct line of attention. He often preferred to watch and listen rather than speak, though many sets of eyes flickered his way. Lyanna felt a pang of protectiveness. He did not yet comprehend the fullness of how people might view him if they knew he was half Targaryen by blood. The realm believed he was just her son, her so-called bastard, as the rumor still ran. Whether that rumor would change or expand in time, Lyanna had yet to decide. Daenerys lifted her hand, calling for silence. The bustle subsided, and she spoke in a clear, steady voice. "Noble lords of the north, loyal allies of the crown, you have all heard the tales, seen the ravens. In the far north, something stirs that endangers us all, something far more dangerous than any petty war over the Iron Throne. Reports of an army of the dead, led by these White Walkers, have reached us. Some of you may doubt. Some of you may think these are bedtime stories. But the Free Folk and the Night's Watch have seen them firsthand. The long night is no myth." A murmur spread through the hall. Several men made warding gestures, mindful of old superstitions. Lyanna looked among them and recognized fear in their eyes. It was one thing to rally them against the Boltons or the Lannisters, human foes, but the undead were another matter. She recalled the hush that fell whenever old Nan told stories of the others. Even the bravest warrior might quail before an enemy immune to fear, immune to reason. Lord Manderly stood, clearing his throat. "Your Grace, House Manderly does not doubt you or the Lady Lyanna. But if these White Walkers are indeed coming, what is it we can do? The Night's Watch is sworn to ward the realm from such evils, but they are few in number now. And after so many wars, the North is scarcely in a position to raise another grand host." Daenerys inclined her head. "I understand, my lord. The realm has been bled by conflict. Many houses still rebuild from the ravages of the Lannisters or from the treacheries of the Boltons. But this threat will not spare us while we rebuild. The dead do not wait for the living to be ready." Lord Glover spoke next, arms folded over his chest. "We've had enough war, Your Grace, but if the tales are true, we may have no choice but to fight again. No southern army can hold the north snows, though. We remember how Stannis Baratheon's men froze on these roads. And if the dead come, how do we even kill them?" Howland Reed placed his hands on the table. His voice was calm. Dragon glass, Valyrian steel, fire. The old stories mention these weapons. The Bolton's fall has given us a measure of freedom to gather resources. In the neck, we have discovered some ancient caches, though not enough to arm a host. There is also dragonglass on Dragonstone, is there not? At that, Tyrion spoke, his voice carrying that slight ring of wry intelligence. Indeed there is, a great deal of it. When we left Dragonstone, we noted entire caverns beneath the fortress brimming with obsidian. We can mine it, shape it, distribute it across the realm. But time is short, and forging that many weapons will take great effort. Daenerys nodded. Then let that be our priority. We must fortify the north. We must also reach out to the Night's Watch and the free folk who followed Tormund Giantsbane or any other leaders. They know this threat intimately. If we can forge an alliance, if the Watch will allow it, we might be able to gather men at the Wall, or at least in the areas south of the Wall, to prepare. Lord Manderley, frowning, glanced at Lyanna. Lady Stark, you have guided us through the aftermath of Bolton tyranny. Your name carries weight in the north. What say you on all this? Lyanna rose. She was no longer the young girl who once galloped across the training yard. Her presence had grown calm and firm in the years of secrecy and hardship. I say that if we do not unite, we will die. This is a threat beyond houses, beyond crowns, beyond any old grudges. The entire realm must stand together. The dead do not care if you wave a direwolf banner or a lion, if you are a Targaryen loyalist or have no love for dragons. They only care about adding to their numbers. We must face them with every ounce of steel and fire we can muster. A hush settled. Then Manderley bowed his head. Very well, Lady Stark. House Manderley stands with the Queen and with Winterfell, in whatever efforts must be taken. A few other lords echoed their support. One by one, they pledged to follow the new Queen's directive, though some voiced lingering concerns. After the council concluded, Daenerys and Lyanna conferred with Tyrion, Davos, and the other key advisors. They agreed that the best immediate action was to begin sending ravens to every corner of Westeros, warning of the threat. The realm was battered, but if all men understood the seriousness of this looming conflict, perhaps Daenerys could rally them as she had rallied so many in Essos. That night, Lyanna walked the ramparts of Winterfell, gazing out over the moonlit fields. She felt the weight of memory pressing on her. Once she had been the cause, or at least the spark, that ignited Robert's rebellion. Now, she found herself trying to unify the realm in the face of something far more terrible. In her youth, she could never have imagined such a twist, and yet it felt oddly fitting. The bitter realm that had devoured her family and her lover might now be saved by the same child who bore both Stark and Targaryen blood. Jon was at the heart of it, though he did not yet realize the full scope. Footsteps crunched on the snow behind her. She turned to see Daenerys approaching, a cloak wrapped around her shoulders. The light of distant torches gleamed on her silver hair. For a moment, they stood side by side in companionable silence, the two women who had once been separated by war and rumor, the sister of Rhaegar Targaryen and the last surviving daughter of Aerys II. They are uneasy, Daenerys said at length, nodding toward the wards and courtyards beyond. And not just because of this threat. The North has known nothing but war these past years. Now I ask them for more. I don't blame them for their weariness. They'll fight, Lyanna said, because I'll stand with them. Daenerys studied her face. You have given me your loyalty, yet I know it must weigh on you that Rhaegar's rightful claim was set aside, or that your son might have a stronger claim by the laws of inheritance. Do you regret it? Lyanna shook her head slowly. No. Once, I might have dreamed of seeing my son crowned as his father's heir. But I've seen enough of war. It's not about the crown anymore, not for me. I only want the realm to survive. Rhaegar believed in prophecy, in destiny. Perhaps I do too, in my own way. But I've learned that the living shape their own stories. If Jon wants the throne when he is grown, that is a question for another time. Right now, the realm needs unity, not division. Daenerys offered a small smile. Wise words. She lifted her gaze to the sky. where a thin layer of clouds drifted across the moon. Sometimes I wonder if my brother Rhaegar is somewhere, watching us. If he would approve of the path we've taken. My father would not. He was mad, consumed by paranoia, but Rhaegar was kinder, from what Barristan told me. He was, Lyanna said softly. She remembered the lilting notes of Rhaegar's harp, how the man carried sorrow in his eyes. He believed the dragon had 3 heads. He believed in a song of ice and fire. I never fully understood it, but I think he saw some union of Stark and Targaryen as crucial to the future. That's why he crowned me with blue roses at Harrenhal. He thought we were meant to create something new. Daenerys let out a gentle breath. Perhaps he was right, in a way neither of us could have predicted. We'll see what the future holds. They parted, each lost in her own thoughts. The wind carried the faint howls of wolves from the forest, and Lyanna found comfort in that sound. The old gods were watching. Winterfell was not alone. In the days that followed, ravens flew south and east, carrying urgent messages to lords who had only recently submitted to Queen Daenerys, or who had stayed out of the war altogether. Some letters were directed to Dorne, which had been in quiet turmoil since the death of Prince Doran and the murder of Princess Alya's children years before, though the knowledge that Lyanna's son was of Alya's husband might stir interesting sympathies. Some ravens went to the Vale, where the young Lord Robert Arryn was guided by Peter Baelish's cunning hand. Some soared to Riverrun, where Edmure Tully had been restored after the Frey's downfall. Every corner of Westeros felt the war's scars. The replies trickled in. Many expressed skepticism about an undead threat. Others pledged to send aid, or at least to watch for any sign of these White Walkers. Meanwhile, the Night's Watch, under the leadership of a First Ranger turned acting Lord Commander, sent word that the Free Folk were massing near Eastwatch by the Sea. According to these reports, a strange cold had settled beyond the wall, and travelers returning from the far north told stories of pale figures lurking in the woods. Daenerys dispatched scouts to ascertain the truth. She also requested that her dragons, Drogon, Regal, and Viserion, be kept well-fed and ready to fly, though the northern climate made for fewer prey and frequent storms. Sometimes, she would take Drogon into the air for a scouting flight over the forests and hills, hoping to spot any signs of the undead. Lyanna watched the black shape of the great dragon cross the gray sky and wondered if their time was running short. Despite the looming threat, governance could not be ignored. From her seat in Winterfell, Daenerys had to address matters of coin, food, and law. The city of King's Landing was left in the hands of a newly appointed governor. Some said Gendry Baratheon, legitimized by royal decree, had stepped in with a small council to keep order. The Lannister banners had been struck down, though pockets of resistance likely remained. Cersei languished in a cell, stripped of her regal finery. Jaime Lannister was rumored to be part of the new council in King's Landing, attempting to mend old wounds. But the Queen's attention now lay in the north, for if the White Walkers poured south, King's Landing would not matter anyway. Jon took to practicing swordsmanship in the courtyard whenever weather permitted. Northmen recognized a natural talent in him. His footwork was agile, and he possessed an unyielding dedication. Even Ser Jorah Mormont, who had joined Daenerys' forces in Essos, commented on the boy's surprising prowess for one so young. Lyanna often watched from the sidelines, the swirl of her cloak about her ankles, a proud warmth in her chest. He was forging a name for himself. Some men whispered he might inherit Winterfell from Lyanna, even if they did not know the deeper truth of his Targaryen blood. One morning, as Jon squared off with a visiting hedge knight, Daenerys herself came to observe. When the bout ended in Jon's victory, the Queen offered him a nod of approval. "You fight well," she told him. Jon bowed his head, still breathing hard. "Thank you, Your Grace." There was admiration in his eyes, but also a quiet curiosity. She was his aunt by blood, though he had been raised only by Lyanna. He'd once confided in Lyanna that he felt drawn to Daenerys somehow. Her presence, her confidence, something intangible. When the night rose from the packed snow, rubbing a bruised shoulder, Daenerys stepped closer to Jon, her voice low enough that only Lyanna, who had approached, could hear. "You seem to learn quickly," If times were kinder, I would have you train with the Unsullied or the Blood Riders to see how you might fare. But perhaps we shall have no choice if these White Walkers come." Jon straightened. "If you wish it, I'll fight for you and for the realm." His sincerity glowed in his dark eyes. Before Daenerys could reply, a horn's call came from atop the walls. A cry rang out, "Riders approaching!" The courtyard bristled with alert as soldiers and guards hurried to see who neared Winterfell. Lyanna exchanged a glance with Daenerys and Jon, then followed the men to the front gate. Beyond the wooden gates, the snow churned under the hooves of a ragged group of riders. They wore the black of the Night's Watch, and with them rode tall, broad-shouldered men and women clad in furs of the free folk. Tormund Giantsbane was among them, his ginger beard coated with frost, eyes alight with urgency. The gate creaked open to admit them, and Tormund wasted no time. He swung down from his horse and swept the assembled watchers with a stern look. "Where's the Queen? Where's the Lady Stark?" he demanded, his breath steaming in the cold. "We've seen them, the dead. They're moving faster than we thought." Men parted to reveal Daenerys and Lyanna stepping forward. The hush was absolute as Tormund's voice carried to them. "They're already near the wall," he said, pointing over his shoulder. "Eastwatch might hold them for a time, but they have giant whites, skin as pale as milk, and eyes like blue stars. If we can't stop them at the wall, they'll smash through." Daenerys's brow furrowed. "How many?" "More than we can count," Tormund replied. "Thousands upon thousands. And the Night King, aye, the stories are true. He's real and he leads them." The great hall again became the center of frantic discussion. Tormund, the Night's Watch men, and some of the free folk elders recounted what they'd witnessed. Entire villages raised as whites, animals turned into undead beasts, an unstoppable host that moved in eerie silence. One of the watchmen looked as though he'd seen every horror imaginable. He sat trembling near the hearth, sipping hot wine as he tried to speak. "Eastwatch might hold," he said, voice quavering. "But if they break through or find another path, we're all doomed." Daenerys stood near the high table, her face somber but decisive. "Then we must gather our forces at the wall. The realm must see this threat with their own eyes, or many will remain skeptical. If we can destroy their leader, perhaps the rest will fall. But we need proof for the Southern Lords who still drag their feet. We need to show them the truth of this undead army." Tyrion cleared his throat. Bringing a White South was once proposed as a plan to convince Cersei. But with Cersei in chains, we only have to convince those who remain neutral or uncertain. Some lords of the Reach, the Vale, or the Crownlands. Still, it might help unify all of Westeros if we demonstrate unequivocally that the dead are real. "How do you propose we capture such a creature?" Lyanna asked, worry gnawing at her. "It's dangerous enough just to fight them, let alone try to trap one." Grey Worm spoke quietly. "The Unsullied are disciplined, but this is a task that sounds risky." Daenerys pressed her lips together. "We will consider a small, swift party. Volunteers only. They will travel to the edge of the undead host, isolate a single white if possible, and bring it back south as proof. Meanwhile, the main armies will gather near the wall to help defend it. If the Night King attacks in full force, we'll need every hand to hold him back." An uneasy silence followed. Daenerys's idea was born of necessity, but the risk was glaring. Yet Tormund, unafraid, shrugged his massive shoulders. "I'll go. Better than waiting for the dead to come knocking." Jon, who had been standing near the dais, spoke up. "I'll go as well." A spike of alarm shot through Lyanna. She turned sharply. "Jon, no. You're young and I will not risk." He met her gaze. She saw resolve in his eyes. "Mother, I'm old enough to fight. If we succeed, we might save thousands by convincing the realm to send help. If we fail, then the dead march anyway. I can't stand idle." There was a hush as those gathered waited for Lyanna's response. She knew the risk was terrible. He was only 13, an age the North might consider near manhood, yet still so young. But she also sensed in him the same unwavering sense of duty that Ned once carried. The same moral core that made him want to protect the innocent. She remembered how Ned had gone south to protect Robert's children, to shield the realm from tyranny, and lost his head for it. Yet if Jon did nothing, if they all did nothing, the realm might drown under an endless tide of ice and death. Daenerys placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "Are you certain?" she asked gently. "This will be no easy task." Jon nodded. "I am." Lyanna closed her eyes, swallowing back her maternal fear. She forced herself to speak calmly. "Then I will go as well." This startled several of the Watchers, including Tormund. He barked out a laugh. "You, Lady Stark? I know you're made of iron, but I survived Robert's rebellion, the Tower of Joy, and years of hiding," Lyanna said firmly. "I will not hide now, not from this. If we are to rally the North, they must see that a Stark fights on the front lines." And privately, she thought, "If Jon is going, I will not let him face this horror alone." Daenerys's expression was torn. "If both of you go, that leaves," Tyrion interjected. "Your Grace, we need one of them here to coordinate with the main host. The plan is to rally the armies and bring them to the wall. Yes, but if something goes wrong..." Lyanna did not wait for Tyrion to finish. "If we want the North to truly commit, then the presence of a Stark is essential out there, beyond the wall. But the Queen's Council is correct that one must remain here to coordinate. Jon, let me do this. You stay here at Winterfell to help the Queen gather the armies. The Lords trust you." "No," Jon said, surprisingly adamant. "The men won't rally behind me as they do behind you, not yet. They see you as the living myth, the sister of Ned Stark who rose from the grave. I'm just a boy in their eyes. If we want them to take this mission seriously, you should remain. They need to see the Lady of Winterfell as a stable pillar, not galloping off. The truth is, I'm more expendable. If I fall, the realm doesn't lose a Stark it fully recognizes. Let me do this. Let me help Tormund." Lyanna felt her heart clench painfully. She understood his logic, but it stung. She wanted to protest that he was not expendable, that he was her son, that she had fought tooth and nail to keep him safe since the day he was born. But she also felt the ring of truth in his words. As far as the Lords were concerned, Jon was a curious but lesser figure compared to Lyanna Stark, who carried so much of the North's memory in her name. If Lyanna died beyond the wall, it might shatter the fragile unity they were forging. Tyrion chimed in, voice careful. "If Jon believes he can undertake this mission, it might indeed be better for Lady Lyanna to remain. She is integral to maintaining order here, and to forging alliances in your name, your Grace." He offered Daenerys a questioning glance. "But the choice is yours, and Lady Lyanna's." Daenerys's gaze flicked from Jon to Lyanna. She saw the anguish in the older woman's eyes, the determination in the boy's. "We cannot force him to stay," Daenerys said softly. "Jon, if this is truly your wish, I will not deny you. But this will be a volunteer mission of the highest peril. We will gather those willing to join you. No one shall be compelled." "I understand, your Grace." Jon bowed. Lyanna felt as though a hand had closed around her throat. She wanted to shout that she would never let him go, that she would sooner face the dead herself. But the entire hall waited on her words, and her pride warred with her maternal instinct. At last, she swallowed her fear and spoke with trembling calm. If you must go, Jon, then go with all our prayers. But take men you trust, and do not risk yourself needlessly." Jon nodded, sorrow in his eyes at the sight of his mother's distress. "I promise." In the days that followed, preparations for the journey began in earnest. Jon formed a small company that included Tormund Giantsbane, a handful of free folk fighters, several men of the Night's Watch, and to Lyanna's surprise, Ser Jorah Mormont, who volunteered out of a sense of duty to the north and to Daenerys. Gendry Baratheon, visiting from the south, arrived in Winterfell with a modest retinue, and after hearing the plan, insisted on joining as well. He wanted to fight for a realm free from the nightmares of the dead, and he had no love for cold politics. They gathered dragonglass weapons forged in the newly installed smithies. Under the guidance of men from Dragonstone, arrowheads and spear tips of obsidian were shaped, though supply was limited. Lyanna quietly arranged a few additional items for Jon. a warm cloak lined with thick fur, a Valyrian steel dagger that Tyrion said had once been used in a plot against Bran Stark, recovered in the confusion after the war. She placed the dagger in Jon's hand, her voice hushed. "Keep this with you. Valyrian steel will kill a White Walker if your obsidian breaks." Jon's fingers closed around the hilt. "Thank you, Mother." She tried to sound strong. "Come back safe, or I'll march beyond the wall myself to drag you home." A faint smile played on his lips, though worry clouded his eyes. "I will. I promise." The morning came, gray and cold, when the small party of volunteers gathered in Winterfell's courtyard, preparing to depart for Eastwatch. Snow drifted from the ashen sky, and the men's breath formed clouds around them. Daenerys, Tyrion, Grey Worm, and Lyanna stood at the gate to see them off. Daenerys's dragons roost on the battlements, watchful. The rest of the realm's armies were still assembling across the north, but progress was slow. Winter roads were treacherous, supplies were scarce, and it would take time to ready a proper force for the wall's defense. Jon wore dark leathers and the new fur cloak, looking older than his years. He clasped arms with Tormund. Ser Jorah hovered near, checking the straps of his saddle. Gendry tested the heft of a warhammer reminiscent of his father's old weapon, though simpler in design. The men of the watch were grim-faced, each carrying obsidian spears. Daenerys stepped forward. "You travel under my banner, even if it is not pinned to your back. Remember what we ask of you, a single white proof for the realm. But your lives matter more than that. Return safely if you can." The group nodded. Jon gave the queen a respectful bow, then his gaze flicked to Lyanna. She stepped forward, her heart pounding. She wanted to embrace him, to hold him as she had when he was small, but he was nearly as tall as she was now, and dozens of eyes were watching. Instead, she placed a hand on his cheek. "I'll have the maester keep a raven ready for any word. I'll do everything in my power to gather help for the coming war." Jon pressed his palm over her gloved hand. No words were needed. Then he turned away, mounted his horse, and led the party out the gate. Their figures disappeared into the snow-laden gloom. Lyanna stood there long after they were out of sight, her heart seized by fear. Days turned into a week without word. Tension coiled around Winterfell. Daenerys pored over maps with Tyrion, deciding how best to deploy the eventual host. Lords Glover, Manderly, Serwyn, and Reed came and went, discussing supply lines. The Dothraki grew restless in the frigid climate. The Unsullied drilled daily in the courtyard, their discipline unwavering. Lyanna spent her time meeting with northern lords, trying to soothe their anxieties and keep them committed to the queen's cause. The nights were long, the old tapestries dancing with shadows as the fires guttered. Sometimes, Lyanna would wander the halls, remembering simpler days when she was only a girl with a wild spirit. Now she was a woman burdened by the knowledge of a monstrous threat. She prayed to the old gods for Jon's safety. At last, a raven arrived from Eastwatch. It bore only a terse message: battle beyond the wall, surrounded by undead, retreating to Frozen Lake. Need help. No signature, but the Maester of Eastwatch confirmed it came from a watch scout who had returned half-frozen with news. Panic rippled through the halls. Tyrion and Daenerys convened an emergency meeting, with Lyanna in attendance. "How quickly can we fly the dragons there?" Daenerys demanded, glancing at Grey Worm. "In this weather, perhaps half a day," Grey Worm answered. "But it would be perilous. The winds are strong, and we do not know the exact location." "We know enough," Daenerys retorted. "They said a frozen lake. That must be north of Eastwatch, along the White Knife tributary or the smaller lakes near the Frostfangs. I can search from above." Tyrion tried to argue caution. "Your Grace, if you fly into a blizzard of undead, you risk losing the dragons or worse. We cannot gamble them. The war might be lost if the Night King kills your dragons." Lyanna stepped forward, heart hammering. "We cannot let them die. My son is among them, not to mention Tormund, Ser Jorah, Gendry, and the others who volunteered. If you can rescue them." Daenerys gave her a resolute nod. "I will. The time for caution is past." If the whites devour our men and turn them, we lose more than just a handful of brave souls. We lose the chance to convince the realm. We lose the chance to fight back effectively. And so she prepared to take Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion beyond the wall. The wind howled across Winterfell's ramparts as the queen donned warmer leathers and furs. Grey Worm organized a small retinue, but ultimately only a handful of Dothraki and Unsullied could ride the dragons. And even that was questionable. No one but Daenerys truly rode them, though she had learned that they might carry a few additional men on harnesses. Lyanna insisted on going, but Daenerys refused. "Your presence must remain here," Daenerys said gently. "If something happens to me or the dragons, you'll be the only major figure left who can unite the North to continue this fight. If I fail, you must gather the realm's forces. You must not join me on this flight. It's too risky." Lyanna wanted to protest, but the queen's logic was unassailable. With a heavy heart, she watched as Daenerys climbed onto Drogon's back in the courtyard. The beast snorted plumes of hot breath into the icy air. Rhaegal and Viserion, having grown more accustomed to the north but still unsettled by the cold, flapped their wings anxiously. In harness-like seats behind Daenerys, 2 Unsullied and a Dothraki rider strapped themselves in. The other 2 dragons each carried minimal additional weight, mostly supplies. Tyrion, with a pale face, stood off to the side, clearly relieved that Daenerys had not asked him to come. The savage weather alone would have been daunting. The trio of dragons took flight, their roars echoing over Winterfell as swirling snow parted around them. Lyanna shielded her eyes from the gust of wind they generated, her heart pounding. She silently prayed to the old gods to guide Daenerys to Jon before it was too late. Hours stretched into a day, then 2. News came at last when the watchers on the battlements spotted the dark shapes returning in the gray sky. A horn sounded as men rushed to the courtyard. The dragons descended, battered by cold winds. Lyanna's eyes fixed on them, searching for a sign of Jon or the others. She saw Daenerys on Drogon, her face stricken, tears frozen to her cheeks. The first to dismount was a Dothraki warrior, caked in frost. Then came an Unsullied soldier, bloodied and shaken. Lyanna's fear roared to life when she saw no sign of Rhaegal or Viserion in the sky. Only Drogon. Daenerys slid from Drogon's flank and nearly collapsed. Grey Worm helped her remain upright. Tyrion and Lyanna surged forward, crowding her with questions. But the queen's trembling voice held them at bay. "They're safe," she managed, her eyes red-rimmed. "Jon, Tormund, the others, they escaped. But we lost Viserion, the Night King. He threw a spear of ice, brought the dragon down. The last I saw of them was beyond the wall, but we rescued Jon's company. I left Rhaegal to help them fly out, but I had no choice but to come back here. I was wounded, Drogon was wounded. We had to return." Lyanna's mind spun. "Jon is alive?" Daenerys nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, we managed to pull them onto Rhaegal's back. They flew west, perhaps aiming for Castle Black or Eastwatch. He told me to go, that he would meet us. The dead were swarming. Viserion fell. The Night King raised him from the ice. A white dragon now, I fear." Horror clutched Lyanna's chest. A white dragon? The notion threatened to undo her. If the White Walkers commanded a dragon, they held a weapon no wall could stop. Tyrion helped Daenerys inside, into the warmth of the castle. Maesters rushed to attend her cuts and bruises, while the men who had returned with her were given hot meals and rest. The entire castle buzzed with the news. One dragon lost, potentially turned, and the rescue mission only partly successful. Lyanna tried to remain calm, holding on to the hope that Jon was alive. But the thought of him out there in the frozen wilderness, riding a wounded dragon, chased by an army of the dead, made her skin crawl. For a day, no word came. Then, near dawn on the following morning, an exhausted raven arrived from Castle Black. The letter contained a few sparse lines. Jon Snow arrived, wounded, but alive. Tormund, Gendry, Ser Jorah, and others as well, resting. Will return to Winterfell after they recover. White captured. The message was signed with the name of a Night's Watch steward at Castle Black. Lyanna nearly sobbed with relief as she read it. They had succeeded. They had a white, and Jon was alive though injured. She immediately ordered horses and a maester to ride north to Castle Black, to bring them safely home. Meanwhile, Daenerys lay abed, recovering from frostbite and bruised ribs. Drogon's hide sported a ragged tear where the ice spear had grazed him, but the dragon would heal, or so the maesters believed. The conversation in Winterfell's halls shifted to the horrifying realization that the White Walkers had claimed a dragon of their own. Men whispered of an undead beast, unstoppable in the skies, driven by the Night King's cold will. Some lords shook their heads in dismay, while others muttered that perhaps it was time to flee south. But fleeing was pointless. The dead would come eventually, and no corner of Westeros could remain safe forever. When Jon at last returned to Winterfell, brought on a litter by the Night's Watch and the retinue Lyanna had dispatched, he was feverish and bandaged. Lyanna rushed to meet him in the courtyard, ignoring decorum. He was awake, but pale, a healing slash across his ribs and a raw bruise on his leg. Tormund helped him dismount. She embraced her son, mindful of his injuries, tears threatening to spill. "You reckless boy," she murmured. "But I'm so glad you're home." Jon managed a wan smile. "We got the white. It's held in a cage of dragonglass, strapped with iron, waiting to be shown to the lords if need be." Tormund gave a dismissive grunt. "A nasty piece of business, that." The creature screeches day and night, snapping its jaws. "We had to keep it away from the horses or it frightened them to madness." Lyanna accompanied Jon into the castle, where he was laid on a bed in a warm chamber near the great hall. Maesters arrived to tend to him. Daenerys, still limping slightly, came as well, relief shining in her eyes at the sight of him. "You saved me," Jon whispered, voice raspy. "You came for us on the dragons." She reached for his hand, ignoring the onlookers. "I did what I had to. I'm just sorry about Viserion." A flicker of grief crossed Jon's face. It was horrible watching him fall. The Night King, he was so calm, as though he knew you would come, as though he was waiting for a chance to claim a dragon. He commanded the dead to form ranks around our party, forced us onto that frozen lake. If not for Gendry running back to Eastwatch, we'd have had no chance. Gendry, standing behind Tormund, gave a self-conscious shrug. "I ran as fast as I could." Lyanna laid a hand on Jon's shoulder. "Rest now. We'll sort out what to do next. The realm must be told of this white dragon. It changes everything." In the days that Jon convalesced, the caged white remained outside Winterfell's walls, guarded and inspected by the bravest men. Words could not describe the macabre horror of it. A shambling corpse, half-frozen, jaws clacking, eyes burning blue. Some faint stench of death lingered around it, even in the freezing cold. Lord Manderly, Glover, and others who had doubted needed only one glimpse before swearing themselves to the fight without reservation. Daenerys, Tyrion, and Lyanna met in the Solar to decide their next steps. On a table lay a map of Westeros, dotted with figurines representing armies. "The time has come to unify the realm," Tyrion said gravely. "We have the proof. We can bring it to a gathering of major lords, call it a great council, if you will, somewhere central. Show them the white, prove the threat. Demand their aid." Daenerys tapped a slender finger on the map. "Where would we gather them? King's Landing is half in ruins, and the Crownlands are not entirely safe. The Dragon Pit might serve, but the city is in no condition to host delegates." Tyrion considered. "There is Harrenhal, an enormous ruin with enough space to house many lords. A cursed place, but neutral ground, in a sense." Lyanna grimaced. Harrenhal was where Rhaegar had crowned her queen of love and beauty all those years ago. That place held painful echoes. "Or perhaps we can do it at Moat Cailin, an old fortress, true, but it would require the southern lords to come north, which might be unwise in winter. They might refuse, especially if they fear traveling these roads." Daenerys frowned in thought. "What if we hold the meeting at Riverrun? A Tully seat, but not so far north that we risk the weather. Not so far south that we lose time. And the Tullys have reason to ally with us after what the Lannisters did to them. We can secure the site easily enough." Lyanna and Tyrion exchanged glances, nodding. It made sense. Riverrun was more intact than Harrenhal, and more amenable than King's Landing for a large gathering. The Tullus, once allied with the Starks, might be persuaded to host. "Then we call for a council of all major houses," Daenerys said. "From Dorne to the north. Show them the White. Explain that the Night King has a dragon. Let them see the gravity of our situation. If they still refuse to unite, then the blood that follows is on their hands." They agreed. Ravens flew once again, summoning lords to Riverrun in what they described as a council of survival. Jon, still recovering, expressed a desire to attend, to speak personally of what he'd seen beyond the wall, but Lyanna insisted that if he was well enough to ride, they would go together. She would not leave him behind again. The two of them, along with Daenerys, Tyrion, and a retinue including the caged White, prepared for the journey south. Grey Worm would remain in Winterfell with half the Unsullied to fortify the castle against any raids from the undead or opportunistic foes. Tormund and many of the free folk would remain near the wall, helping the Night's Watch shore up Eastwatch and Castle Black. Time was short. Rumors swirled that the Night King was moving swiftly, using the power of his new ice dragon to bring down sections of the wall. None had confirmed this horrifying possibility yet, but the tension in every corner of the castle was palpable. Departing Winterfell felt like a twisted echo of the day Lyanna had once been carried south for Robert's rebellion. But the roads were far more hostile now, with deep snowdrifts and howling winds. Daenerys insisted on traveling by horse rather than dragon, to conserve the beast's strength for potential battles and to keep them closer to the north in case the wall fell. Drogon and Rhaegal flew overhead for part of the journey, scouting. The columns of men moved at a slow pace, burdened by supply wagons and the grotesque cage that held the White. Jon rode near his mother, occasionally adjusting the bandage beneath his cloak. Lyanna offered him gentle words, urging him not to push himself too hard. But his mind was fixed on what he had witnessed, the unstoppable mass of the undead, the chilling presence of the Night King. "He looked at me," Jon murmured one evening as they made camp. "Through the flames and the swirling snow, he looked right at me. I've never felt such cold. It was like death itself, staring back." Lyanna placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We will do all we can to stop him. You've done a great service, capturing this White so the realm might believe." He gave a weak shrug. "We lost a dragon in the process. Sometimes I wonder if we haven't just given him more power." Lyanna had no answer for that. The thought of an undead dragon chilled her to the marrow, but they could not change what had happened. They could only press onward. The journey to Riverrun took many weeks, slowed by the winter conditions. Along the way, they collected smaller contingents of soldiers from loyal houses. Some recognized Lyanna Stark with awe, as though seeing a living ghost. Daenerys, though she had ridden in triumph into King's Landing, now wore a more somber aspect. She was not so much a conqueror as a traveler seeking allies against an existential threat. Tyrion tried to keep spirits up with wry observations, but even his wit felt subdued. At last, they approached Riverrun's stout walls. The Tully banners, silver trout on a field of red and blue, fluttered in the icy wind. Edmure Tully, once prisoner of the Freys, now stood as the restored lord of Riverrun. He emerged to greet them, flanked by knights who wore the Tully colors. The gates opened to admit Daenerys and Lyanna's party, the caged White placed under heavy guard in the courtyard. Men and women recoiled at its rattling moans, many crossing themselves in dread. Inside the great hall, Edmure welcomed Daenerys, Lyanna, and Jon with the formalities due to a queen and to the sister of his old friend Eddard Stark. His face bore lines of sorrow from the years of captivity, but he was determined to do his part. He led them to private chambers where they could rest and wash away the dust of the road. In the days that followed, lords arrived from across Westeros to attend the Council of Survival. From the Vale came Robin Arryn, guided by Peter Baelish, who offered his usual silky courtesies. From the Stormlands rode a new lord, one of the lesser Baratheon cousins who had survived the war. A handful of Martell bannermen arrived from Dorne, where the rule was uncertain after the Sand Snake's downfall. The Reach sent Lady Brienne of Tarth in the name of House Tyrell, though the Tyrell line had been all but extinguished with Margaery's death in the war. Nonetheless, the lesser houses of the Reach saw her as an honorable representative. The Westerlands were mostly in disarray, but Jaime Lannister arrived on behalf of whatever remnants were loyal to the crown, accompanied by Bronn and a small retinue. From King's Landing itself came Gendry Baratheon, who had left a caretaker council in his stead. They gathered in Riverrun's Grand Hall, a circle of lords, knights, and advisors. Tension crackled in the air as old enmities were set aside, or at least muted by the gravity of the summons. Daenerys sat at the head of the assembly, with Lyanna and Tyrion flanking her. Jon stood behind them, along with Ser Jorah and Grey Worm, who had arrived with more Unsullied as a security detail. Edmure Tully observed from a seat of honor. Daenerys rose, her voice carrying across the chamber. "We have called you here not to demand fealty, not to fight another war of thrones, but to warn you of the great darkness that marches upon us from the north. We have seen it with our own eyes. The White Walkers are real, and they command an army of the dead, including one of my own dragons who has been turned against us. If the wall falls, they will swarm into the Seven Kingdoms. None will be spared." A ripple of unease spread through the gathering. Some had heard rumors, but hearing it spoken plainly in such a setting was different. Peter Baelish flicked his gaze around, measuring the reactions. Jaime Lannister's face was set, thoughtful. Gendry frowned deeply, one hand flexing around the pommel of his sword. Robin Arryn looked half terrified, glancing to Baelish for reassurance. Tyrion stepped forward. "Many of you may doubt, but we have brought proof." He gestured, and two Unsullied led in a wheeled cage covered with thick canvas. A sickening hiss emanated from beneath. The men placed it at the center of the circle and withdrew the canvas. Gasps and startled cries erupted as the caged wight lunged, snapping its rotten jaws and clawing at the iron bars. Its eyes burned an otherworldly blue. The stench of decay wafted through the hall. Several lords recoiled, pale. Peter Baelish narrowed his eyes, but even he seemed rattled. Jaime set his jaw, face grim, while Lady Brienne's hand reflexively dropped to her sword hilt. "This is but one of thousands," Daenerys said. "Thousands upon thousands. You cannot reason with them, cannot bribe or threaten them. They do not feel pain or fear. They only kill, and every dead man they kill joins their ranks." Lyanna took a breath, standing. "I am Lyanna Stark. Some of you may know my story. Others may not. I was hidden away for decades, but I stand before you to urge you. Heed the Queen. The threat is real. My own son barely survived an expedition beyond the wall to bring you this proof. Even then, we lost one of her dragons to the Night King's power. A white dragon is out there, a terror in the skies." A hush followed, broken only by the caged wight's snarls. Then Edmure Tully rose, his voice trembling slightly. "I stand witness to this horror. Let none say House Tully will not lend its full strength to the Queen's cause. We remember the loyalty of House Stark, and we believe Lady Lyanna's words." Robin Arryn, spurred by Baelish's subtle gesture, stammered, "The Vale stands too. We'll send men. The Eyrie can be a refuge if the realm is overrun." He looked about, eyes fearful, and Baelish nodded with a half-smile. Jaime Lannister spoke, his tone subdued. "The Lannister forces are broken, scattered, but those who remain loyal to me, loyal to the realm, will fight. I owe it to the memory of my brother, my father, and those we wronged." His gaze flicked to Tyrion, who offered the barest nod in return. One of the Dornish lords stepped forward. "Dorne has bled for Targaryens and for Martells. We did not come here to kneel, but for this threat, we will stand with you, Queen Daenerys." Gendry Baratheon cleared his throat, shifting on his feet. "I'm no lord by birth, but I've been recognized as Robert Baratheon's son. The Stormlands will do what we can. I won't see the realm overrun by monsters." Gradually, more voices rose, pledging men or supplies, or at least a willingness to discuss joint strategy. For once, No one seemed eager for a petty fight over titles or land. They were unified by dread. Tyrion nodded, taking mental stock of how many swords and spears they might field. Daenerys raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. "You have all my thanks, but I must warn you. The road ahead is harsh. Winter is here, and the dead may move faster than we anticipate. Return to your lands if you must, gather your forces, but be prepared to march north and meet us near the wall. We must hold the line there or all is lost." Lyanna's mind drifted to the vision of that monstrous white dragon. She prayed they could fortify the wall in time, or failing that, find another vantage point to stop the undead hordes from sweeping over the entire continent. The council broke into smaller discussions. Men formed alliances, speaking quietly of supply lines and winter routes. Lyanna found herself cornered by Peter Baelish, who offered a courteous bow. "My lady," he said in that silken voice, "it is an honor to finally meet you properly. I was but a boy when last we might have crossed paths. You've caused quite a stir, returning from the grave." She regarded him coolly. "And you've caused your share of stir, Lord Baelish, if half the rumors about you are true." His thin lips curved. "I do what I must to survive. The realm is precarious, and these undead complicate matters. But perhaps we can set aside old intrigues in the face of this new threat. The veil will certainly do its part, as young Robin indicated." Lyanna allowed a thin smile. "Let's hope your actions match your words. I won't abide more manipulation of my kin." He bowed again. "I only serve the future of the realm, my lady." Then he drifted away, leaving Lyanna with a sense of unease. She wondered what game he played even now. Elsewhere, Jon found himself speaking with Jaime Lannister and Gendry. The older men examined him with curiosity. Gendry, near in age but a bit older, clapped him on the shoulder. "You're a brave one going beyond the wall. I barely made it out of that alive. Where'd you learn to fight?" Jon shrugged. "Training in Essos, the Neck, the North. A bit of everything. My mother taught me what she could, but I had many teachers." Jaime, his golden hand glinting in the torchlight, eyed Jon thoughtfully. "You remind me a bit of your Uncle Ned." A flicker of regret passed over Jaime's features, likely remembering how he had once sat the Iron Throne for a brief moment after killing the Mad King, how Ned Stark had found him there. He was honorable to a fault. "May you be wiser." Jon, uncertain how to respond, simply said, "I only want to protect the living from what I've seen." That night, the caged wight was sequestered in a secure cellar, guarded by a rotating watch. The council's immediate objective had been achieved. Nearly every lord had agreed to send men. Some might drag their feet or fail to muster in time, but for now, there was a sense of unprecedented unity across the realm. Even Dorne, historically suspicious of Targaryens after Elia Martell's fate, agreed that stopping the undead overshadowed old grudges. The next day, Daenerys announced she would return north with her retinue to oversee final preparations and gather the bulk of her armies near the wall. The southern lords would gather their forces and follow as soon as they could. Lyanna, mindful of Winterfell's need for her presence, agreed to ride back with the queen. Tyrion and the other advisors planned out routes and supply stations, hoping to avoid starvation on the harsh winter roads. As they all made ready to depart, the question remained, would they arrive before the wall fell? Days of slow travel ensued once more. The caged wight accompanied them, though now mostly as a symbol of urgency to any fortress they passed. Some men who had not attended the council at Riverrun got a glimpse of the horror and quickly pledged what resources they could spare. Others cursed the unnatural sight, crossing themselves as though it might ward off evil. But many common folk simply stared in terror or huddled inside their huts, praying this wave of monstrous war would pass them by. Soldiers under the Targaryen banner marched with stoic determination, while the northern men, who recognized Lyanna Stark, found renewed vigor in her presence. Jon spent much of the journey silent, occasionally wincing at his healing injuries. He confided in Lyanna that he was still troubled by nightmares of the frozen lake, the wights crawling from the ice, and the sudden, piercing shriek of Viserion as the Night King's spear struck home. he felt guilt, too, that his mission had led to the dragon's demise. Lyanna tried to reassure him that the blame lay with the Night King, not him. But guilt is rarely banished by mere words. As they neared Moat Cailin, they encountered a ragged band of refugees from the far north. Free folk, it seemed, who had slipped past the wall. They claimed they had witnessed the Night King flying south on an undead dragon, blackening the sky with an icy storm that froze the land in its wake. The pass near Eastwatch had collapsed, or so they said, blasted by blue flames. This news ignited a panic among Daenerys's men. If the undead were already south of the wall, the entire plan to mount a defense might be undone. Daenerys pressed them for details. They described an apocalyptic sight. The dragon's breath was a cold, crackling flame, shattering ice and rock. The Night King rode upon it as if borne by a vile wind. The army of the dead poured through the gap, unstoppable. The watchers on the wall who survived had scattered, sending ravens. Lyanna realized with a sinking heart that there was no longer a simple northern front to hold. The dead could be marching across the Gift even now, perhaps only days from Winterfell. They had no choice but to quicken their pace. Daenerys spurred her horse forward, and the entire column marched through the night. Snow whirled around them, the sky a monotony of gray. After a day and a half of nearly non-stop travel, they reached Winterfell, where Grey Worm and the garrison greeted them with grim expressions. The ravens from the wall had arrived. Eastwatch was lost. The undead were moving south. The war for the dawn had truly begun. Chaos reigned within the castle as the Queen's host scrambled to fortify positions, bring in supplies, and prepare for a siege. The moat around Winterfell was widened, stakes hammered into place, barrels of pitch and oil prepared for burning. Lyanna oversaw the distribution of dragonglass weapons. Tyrion conferred with Grey Worm about defensive lines. Daenerys visited the Godswood, standing before the heart tree with eyes full of worry, perhaps seeking some hint of guidance in the old magic of the north. Jon, still not fully healed, insisted on helping train the raw recruits in the courtyard. Lyanna knew the undead would not delay. They would come as soon as the Night King led them. Their advantage was sheer numbers and the unstoppable nature of whites. Hers was an alliance of living men and 2 living dragons, Rhaegal and Drogon, though if the Night King had Viserion, that might balance the scales or even tilt them in his favor. She could hardly believe this was the same world where once, as a girl, she had worried about a forced marriage to Robert Baratheon. Now, the fate of the realm balanced on the edge of an otherworldly war. The scouts confirmed the worst. The army of the dead was only 3 days' march away. Some men wanted to flee south, but Daenerys and Lyanna insisted on standing their ground. Tyrion pointed out that if Winterfell fell, the dead would sweep down the continent unopposed. They had no choice but to fight here, in the seat of House Stark, hoping reinforcements from the southern lords would arrive in time. Men shivered on the battlements, scanning the horizon. The caged wight in the courtyard thrashed, almost as if it sensed its brethren nearing. Each dawn, the watchers expected to see a swirling mass of undead on the horizon, led by a monstrous dragon with icy blue flames. Anxiety gnawed at them. A bitter wind from the north froze the puddles in the courtyard each night, turning them to treacherous ice by morning. Food ran low. Some archers coughed from exposure. Yet they waited. On the second dawn, horns blared. Figures appeared in the snow, but they were not the dead. They were banners of the Vale and some from the Riverlands, surging forward to join the defense. At their head rode Peter Baelish, Robin Arryn, and Edmure Tully, accompanied by what cavalry they could muster. The gates opened to admit them, and inside, the newly arrived forces found meager shelter. Peter Baelish's face bore that calculating smile, though Lyanna imagined even he was quaking inside at the thought of an undead horde. Edmure Tully looked relieved to have arrived in time, though he asked worriedly, "Where is the rest? The Martells, the Baratheons, the Lannisters?" Jaime said he would come with what men he had left. Is he near? No one knew. No ravens had come from the south in days. Either storms had blocked flight or the messages were lost. That night, the horns blew again, this time in frantic alarm. Lyanna, jolted from a restless sleep, threw on her cloak and raced to the battlements. Torchlight flickered, revealing Daenerys, Tyrion, and Grey Worm already there. In the distance, a swirling white haze advanced across the plains, as if a storm had taken shape and was moving of its own accord. Then came a piercing screech unlike anything Lyanna had heard. A dragon's roar, but twisted, broken, echoing with unholy resonance. Men along the wall gripped their weapons. Daenerys stood still, her face pale. "Viserion," she whispered. An eerie blue glow illuminated the snowfall, and the shape of a dragon loomed in the darkness beyond. The army of the dead had arrived. Trumpets and horns sounded through Winterfell, calling all to arms. Archers scrambled to the walls. Men stoked the fires, unsullied formed ranks, and Dothraki readied their curved blades. Northmen clutched spears tipped with dragonglass. Lords shouted commands. Horses whinnied, eyes rolling in panic. Lyanna felt her pulse hammer as she peered over the battlements. In the gloom, she could make out the silent ranks of wights, thousands strong, stretching far enough that she could not see where they ended. A wave of death, blanketed in swirling snow. Then a column of blue flame spewed from the monstrous shape overhead, and the outer defenses of Winterfell erupted in ice and shattered stone. Screams rose. Arrows were loosed in vain, many falling short or merely bouncing off the undead dragon's icy scales. Daenerys roared an order. "Bring the dragons!" Rhaegal and Drogon, kept behind the walls, shrieked in response, launching into the stormy sky. Soldiers on the ground, half blinded by snow, readied for the onslaught as wights began to surge forward. Lyanna drew a dragonglass-forged sword, her heart in her throat. She glanced at Jon, who stood near her in the thick swirl of men. He nodded once, fear plain in his eyes, but resolved. In a thunderous collision, the army of the dead reached the living defenders. The battle for Winterfell began. For hours, the night was a blur of chaos. Wights hurled themselves against the walls, clawing over each other. Obsidian arrows took them down by the dozen, but more and more replaced them, an unending tide. Flaming pitch rained from the walls, igniting many, but the snow and ice fought to smother the flames. The shrieks of dying horses, men, and undead mingled with the roar of dragons. Lyanna found herself in the courtyard, hacking at wights that tumbled over the ramparts, her arms shaking with fatigue. She caught glimpses of Jon fighting alongside the northern men, eyes fierce with determination. Tormund, arrived from the wall in time, bellowed war cries in the chaos. In the sky overhead, Daenerys and Drogon clashed with Viserion, the undead dragon. Spectral blue flames met living red-orange fire. The watchers below saw flashes of light in the clouds, heard savage roars, witnessed glimpses of reptilian shapes entangled in midair. Rhaegal swooped to aid Drogon, biting at Viserion's flank, but the undead beast refused to fall. The Night King sat upon Viserion's back, javelins of ice in hand. At one point, a hush fell across the battlefield as a giant wight, easily twice the height of any man, smashed through Winterfell's gate. Northmen and Vale Knights rushed to stop it. Lyanna sprinted toward the giant, blade in hand, but the monstrous figure swept men aside with an icy club. She barely dodged a swing, tumbling into the snow. The giant roared, blackened mouth yawning wide, but a pair of archers loosed dragonglass-dipped arrows into its milky eyes. The beast howled, then crashed to the ground, shaking the earth. Still, the undead poured in. The defense lines started collapsing inward, men forced to retreat to the second courtyard. Screams echoed across the yard as the living were overwhelmed. Lyanna's arms burned from swinging her sword. Jon, blood-spattered, fought a group of wights that had broken through. She darted to his side, cutting down a corpse that nearly tore into him from behind. He thanked her with a grateful nod, his breath ragged. Above them, a flash of bright flame. Drogon unleashed a torrent of fire that illuminated the entire courtyard, charring wights and nearly scorching living men in the process. Lyanna and Jon ducked behind a fallen wagon for cover, the heat blasting their faces. Through the inferno, she glimpsed the Night King astride Viserion, circling overhead. The undead dragon answered Drogon's flames with a torrent of blue fire. The two beams collided in the sky, swirling embers and ice crystals. Suddenly, Regal came from the side, slamming into Viserion's flank and tearing at its wings. The Night King hurled an ice spear, but Drogon veered away, barely avoiding it. The spear fell into the courtyard below, impaling a cluster of wights. For a heartbeat, Lyanna hoped they had the advantage in the sky. Then the Night King forced Viserion to plow downward, crashing into Regal's shoulder. The impact sent both living and undead dragons spiraling out of control, descending behind the castle into the darkness. The swirling melee in the courtyards and ramparts only intensified. Thousands of wights pressed on. House Manderly's knights attempted a cavalry charge inside the walls, but it devolved into chaos among the pressed bodies of undead. The Vale archers tried to hold a walkway, but once the wights reached them, it was hand-to-hand slaughter. Peter Baelish was seen cowering behind a squad of knights, directing them to push forward. Lyanna found herself pressed back, shoulder to shoulder with Jon. They were surrounded, forced to retreat into the Great Hall. A desperate stand was made there, with men slamming the doors and barricading them. Women, children, and old men huddled inside, trembling. The wights pounded on the barred doors. Blood dripped from Jon's brow where a wight's claw had scraped his temple. Lyanna tried to catch her breath, adrenaline surging. She eyed the hall's main doors. Could they hold? If not, everyone inside would die. "Jon," she gasped. "We have to hold them off. Give the others time to regroup. We can't let them in here." He nodded, swallowing. "We'll hold." Outside, the pounding grew louder. Through a window's shattered remains, Lyanna saw a swirl of snow, flames, and darkness. Screams echoed. She wondered if Daenerys still fought in the sky. She prayed the queen still lived. If both dragons fell, the realm might stand no chance. Then a crash resounded at the hall's main doors. Splinters flew as wights burst through, screeching. Lyanna and Jon rushed to meet them, joined by a handful of guards. Steel rang against bone and frozen flesh. More wights poured in, unstoppable. The defenders fell back step by step, trying to keep the undead from reaching the civilians behind them. Time lost all meaning in the swirl of madness. Lyanna felt her muscles burning, each breath ragged. She thrust her dragonglass sword into a wight's chest, watched it collapse. A second wight lunged from the side, forcing her to pivot. Jon decapitated it with a savage blow. The floor was slick with blood and melting snow. Women screamed. Lyanna nearly slipped but managed to stay upright, her mind fixed on survival. A sudden roar shook the entire hall. The roof overhead cracked, sending dust and bits of wood cascading down. Everyone froze, wights, living men, all turned to look as a colossal shape crashed through the upper walls. It was Regal, battered and wounded, struggling to keep flight. The dragon's arrival caused part of the hall's ceiling to collapse, smashing wights in a hail of broken beams. Through the gaping hole, the swirling snow poured in. Regal's green scales glinted with blood, but it unleashed a roar of defiance. Men and women screamed and scattered, though the wights showed no such fear. From behind Regal soared Drogon, scorching the courtyard beyond with a burst of flame. The smell of charred flesh permeated the air. Lyanna glimpsed Daenerys astride Drogon's neck, hair whipping in the gale. The queen guided her mount to the break in the hall, trying to see if Regal was trapped. At that moment, a monstrous form materialized behind them, the Night King on Viserion, looming in a swirl of snow. Time seemed to slow for Lyanna. She saw Daenerys glancing back, saw the Night King raising his icy spear. She heard Jon shout something, though the words were lost in the clamor. In a heartbeat, Viserion unleashed a blast of blue fire at Drogon's flank. Drogon shrieked in agony, nearly bucking Daenerys off. The queen clung desperately to the saddle. The Night King hurled his spear, and Lyanna felt her heart seize. But before the spear struck, a streak of green collided with Viserion. Regal, mustering the last of his strength. The undead dragon's aim faltered, the blue flame scything across Winterfell's ramparts instead. The spear whipped past Drogon's tail, missing by inches. Daenerys urged Drogon upward, away from the breach in the hall. With a furious roar, Drogon unleashed a torrent of flame upon Viserion and the Night King. Viserion shrieked as the living flames engulfed him, but the undead dragon still fought on, immune to normal fire. The Night King raised another spear, but then Rhaegal, battered beyond measure, clamped his jaws around Viserion's neck, dragging them both from the air. They crashed down in a thunder of snapping bones, toppling part of the castle's outer wall. A convulsion of sound followed, the shrieking of dragons, the roar of collapsing stone. Smoke and debris filled the courtyard. Lyanna could not see what became of them. The whites attacking the hall faltered for an instant, as if some directive had been lost. She seized the chance, rallying the defenders to strike back, driving the undead out of the battered doorway. After a frantic assault, the living managed to seal the entrance again. Lyanna and Jon, drenched in sweat and blood, leaned against a pillar, panting. The hall was a ruin, half collapsed, with bodies strewn about. Outside, a horn sounded 3 times, an old signal used by the Night's Watch for others, or a sign of something unexpected. Men in the courtyard whooped in sudden excitement. Lyanna exchanged a puzzled look with Jon, and they stumbled outside, stepping over the bodies. In the courtyard, what remained of the living host parted, letting them through. At the shattered gates of Winterfell, torches illuminated a new sight. More banners, a fresh army arrived. The Baratheon Stag, the Lion of House Lannister, with Jaime in the lead, the Red Spear of Dorne, the Silver Trout of the Tullis who had remained behind. Reinforcements from the south had come at last, forging a frantic charge into the undead ranks that threatened to overrun the castle. Jaime Lannister, grim and determined, led a wedge of cavalry that smashed into a knot of whites, scattering them. Gendry hammered whites apart with his warhammer. The Martell cavalry circled around, slicing down undead from behind. The final wave of Vale Knights followed, picking off stragglers. In the swirl of new arrivals, the undead host reeled, momentarily outflanked. Daenerys, seeing this from atop Drogon high above, bellowed for the living to rally. The defenders of Winterfell, battered though they were, found new courage. They poured from the gates and hallways to join the fight. Jon, ignoring his injuries, dragged himself back into the melee with Lyanna at his side. Arrows flew, swords clashed, and the whites slowly gave ground. Then a keening wail echoed across the night. The living paused to see the source. Behind the walls, the shape of Viserion reared, grievously wounded. Rhaegal had pinned him but was now motionless, dead or dying. The Night King stood amidst the rubble, battered by fallen stones, one arm twisted at an odd angle. He wrenched himself free and tried to call Viserion to him, but the undead dragon could barely move. Daenerys seized the moment. Drogon swooped low, unleashing a final torrent of dragon fire that engulfed the courtyard. The Night King stared up, raising his arms as if to ward off the flames. For an instant, it seemed he might endure the fire again. Blue flame clashed with red above him, but then the stones beneath him cracked, and he stumbled. Tyrion, from the ramparts, yelled something. Lyanna could not hear it over the roar, but she saw the opening. She and Jon raced through the swirling debris toward the Night King. The undead around him were scattered, burned or battered. Jaime Lannister joined them, sword in hand, and Gendry as well. Together, they closed in on the Night King as he tried to regain his footing. His icy eyes flicked up, scanning them. A wave of frosty air emanated from him, chilling them to the bone. Jon hefted the Valyrian steel dagger Lyanna had given him, and Jaime raised his own Valyrian sword. The Night King let out a soundless snarl and hurled a shard of ice at them. Lyanna dove aside, rolling in the snow. The shard whizzed past Gendry's head, missing by inches. Jon lunged, driving the dagger at the Night King's side, but the ancient creature knocked him back with inhuman strength. Jaime swiped at the Night King's flank, only to have his blade deflected by an icy gauntlet. The Night King drew a wicked crystal sword, lunging for Jaime's chest. Jaime, hampered by his golden hand, barely parried. Lyanna forced herself up, ignoring the pain in her limbs. She circled behind the Night King, dragging her dragonglass sword. Jaime tried to keep the foe's attention, but the Night King slammed him aside with terrifying power, sending him crashing into a broken wall. Gendry rushed in, swinging his hammer. The Night King turned, shattering the hammer's haft with one blow. Gendry fell backward, winded. Jon, battered but still determined, came at the Night King again, aiming for its center mass. This time, the creature grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off his feet, the icy eyes boring into Jon's. Jon gasped for air, dropping his dagger in the snow. The Night King tightened its grip, as though about to snap Jon's neck. Lyanna roared, launching herself forward. She plunged her dragonglass sword at the Night King's exposed back. The blade bit deep into the icy armor. The creature stiffened, letting out a sound like grinding glass. It dropped Jon, whirling to face her, the crystal sword slashing. Lyanna felt the blade bite into her side, agony exploding there, but she did not let go of her weapon. With a final push, she drove the dragonglass deeper, twisting with all her strength. A crack spidered across the Night King's torso, glowing with pale light. He stared at her with those luminous blue eyes, mouth opening in silent wrath. Then the crack spread, fracturing his form. Jon, on his knees, seized the Valyrian dagger from the snow and thrust it into the Night King's thigh. That did it. The Night King shattered into 1,000 ice shards, collapsing into the snow at their feet. The effect rippled through the battlefield. Everywhere, wights froze in place, their eyes dimming. One by one, they fell lifeless to the ground or dissolved into dust and bone. A stunned hush swallowed the night's screams. Lyanna staggered, blood seeping from the wound in her side. Jon reached for her, supporting her weight. She collapsed against him, vision swimming. In the courtyard, men gaped at the falling undead, some crying in relief, others simply sinking to their knees from exhaustion. Drogon circled overhead, battered but victorious. Viserion lay still. Rhaegal's body was pinned beneath rubble, silent. "It's over," Jon breathed, looking at the shattered remnants of the Night King. "We did it." Lyanna forced a pained smile. The pain in her side was fierce, but the sense of relief was overwhelming. Around them, men began to cheer weakly, voices rising in the gloom. The army of the dead was broken. The living had prevailed. Daenerys landed Drogon in the courtyard, dismounting with trembling legs. Tyrion, disheveled, arrived from the rampart stairs, his expression one of disbelief. Jaime, bruised but alive, stumbled forward. Gendry offered a hand to help him. Tormund emerged from a corridor, bloodied but grinning in relief. Peter Baelish was nowhere to be seen. Some said he'd fled mid-battle, but none cared at that moment. Lyanna clutched Jon's arm. "Ned would be proud of you," she whispered, tears mingling with the blood on her face. "Rhaegar, too. You saved us all." Jon shook his head, blinking back tears of his own. "No, we did this, together." And in the ragged courtyard of Winterfell, as dawn's first light broke over the cracked battlements, the living gathered amid the ruins. The dead no longer stalked the north. Men tended to the wounded, to the battered dragons, to the broken castle. Daenerys sank to her knees beside Rhaegal's fallen form, tears in her eyes for the dragon that had sacrificed itself to ensure Viserion's final defeat. Drogon, exhausted, folded his wings and rested. Lyanna felt her body weakening, her vision dimming. She sank to the ground, and Jon knelt beside her, calling for a maester. The cold seeped into her, but a strange peace accompanied it. She heard the distant cheers, the murmurs of men praising House Stark, House Targaryen, the Queen, and the new dawn. Snowflakes drifted downward like soft blessings. Lyanna closed her eyes, letting the swirl of triumph and sorrow wash over her. She had lived to see the day the living triumphed over death itself, to see House Stark and House Targaryen stand united. If she died now, she thought she would die fulfilled. But strong arms lifted her, and a maester pressed cloth to her wound. Jon's voice, trembling yet determined, whispered, "Stay with me. You're not done yet." And she thought of all that would come, the rebuilding, the forging of a new realm, free of tyrants and white-fleshed nightmares alike. She managed a weak smile. "I'll try," she breathed. The war was done, but the future had only just begun. Together they would shape it. The living had won the dawn, and Lyanna Stark, no longer a phantom or a secret, had helped lead them there. In the hush that followed, as the men began clearing away the dead, as the sun rose over the walls of Winterfell, a new era began. An era born of tragedy, sacrifice, and hope, in which House Stark and House Targaryen walked side by side across the blood-stained snow, forging a realm that might finally know peace.